the 24th European Conference of the Fondazione Rodolfo Debenedetti on monopsony, wages and working conditions. As usual, the very first session will be in Italian, and I'm very pleased to give the floor to the President of the Fondazione Ingegner Rodolfo Debenedetti, Carlo Debenedetti, l'ingegner Carlo Debenedetti, che rivolgerà un messaggio di saluto.
Who will give us his welcoming words. Allow me, first of all, to say that I was out of precaution asked not to take part directly in your conference, and I will follow you up from a distance. I would also like to thank Tito, Boeri, and Paolo Guidotti for the extraordinary leadership work and the contributions that both have supplied to the foundation. Today we are holding the 24th annual conference of the Ingegner Rodolfo Debenedetti Foundation. The foundation has always attempted in over 20 years of activity to focus the academic and public debate on major issues from a social and economic standpoint. We have attempted to do that without allowing our agenda to be dictated by emergencies or by political propaganda. On the contrary, we have always chosen a long-term outlook. The topic chosen for today's event is no exception to the rule. Today we will be talking about the labor market, where there are distortions associated to monopsony issues. During the day, we will be hearing presentations that will give us an outlook on the possible sources of monopsony, from market concentration, labor market concentration, the agreements amongst employers and non-competitive agreements, and other tools that are indeed very technical in nature, but as we will see, definitely have a concrete fallout on workers, and in particular on wages, and for the ability to seek workplace stability and better work opportunities. There is a negative effect which is associated to all forms of monopsony, which is the employer's ability to set wages at a standard which is lower than that which would be in place in a competitive market. In a monopsonic labor market, the employer can set salaries below the production levels. Today's report will observe how monopsony is present also in the Italian labor market. They will also focus on how they contribute to the stagnation of wages, which characterizes our country. As you will understand, in a time of high inflation and low wage increases, the issue of wages and workers' wage policies have become very topical issues which are often at the core of political debate. Over the last few days, several political parties in Italy have launched the idea of de-taxing the monthly wages. It is a provision that, even if it were to be effective in supporting workers' wages, would be very expensive in terms of the public expenditure. And it can definitely not be considered to be a zero-cost reform. Today, we will be discussing some policy suggestions the aim of which is to mitigate the negative effects on salaries and other qualitative issues in the labor relationship, non-competition agreements and other tools in the labor market, including the elimination of the non-competition clauses for workers with low salaries, the introduction of transparency mechanisms, possible sanctions to be implemented by the antitrust in the event of labor market concentrations or agreements amongst employers. In most cases, the suggestions have a low cost for the state coffers, although the impact could be very high as regards the salaries, the workers' salaries. It is not the first time that the Foundation focuses on an assessment of labor market institutions and all those rules that govern salaries in the Italian market. It has often supported initiatives for the introduction of an hourly minimum wage set by law, which would create the transparency needed to be applied to all workers, including those who escape the collective negotiation system. In 2015 in Rome, in the Banca d'Italia Conference Center, we discussed the minimum salary for Italy. And even before that, in 2007, again in Rome, in the conference on which was entitled The Advantages of Italy, we suggested the introduction of a minimum hourly wage. The Foundation has also focused on studies on the effects of collective negotiations, supporting the need for a reform of the representation system in Italy and the need for collective bargaining on the second level. In this regard, and looking towards the future, I'm pleased to announce that over the next year, the Foundation will be honored to host a lecture by Henry Faber from Princeton University, a well-known worldwide expert on salary issues and industrial relations. Throughout all our initiatives, both past and present, we have been faithful to the spirit which has also always characterized its work. There is the will to offer food for thought and to contribute to an economic politics debate which is informed and based on scientific evidence. We consider that we have managed to provide an even slight support to the debate on the political economics of the country. Allow me to finish by thanking all those people who over the years have worked for the Engineer Rodolfo Debenedetti Foundation. In over 2 decades of activities, the staff has seen dozens and dozens of researchers, many of whom started to work within the Foundation and who are today active in some of the most important Italian and foreign universities. To them, I would like to add the broad network of scholars who collaborate with the Foundation and who follow up our initiatives. To all these people, I would like to give our heartfelt thanks for the commitments they have put into the Foundation, which have supported the results achieved by the Foundation. I would also like to finish by thanking all of those who are present here today to take part in the 24th edition of the Engineer Rodolfo Debenedetti Foundation's event, and fruitful proceedings to all. Thank you.
Grazie, Ingegnere. Grazie per...
Thank you, Engineer, and thank you for your contribution to the discussion. Certainly, you have touched upon the central theme of our today's workshop, and thanks for remembering the different activities of the Foundation that has always focused on collective bargaining and wage determination. The very first initiative by the Foundation was the decentration decentralization of exit clauses that were then discussed in Italy. We start with the opening lecture by Alan Manning.
With his work on monopsony, in particular with the book Monopsony in Motion, he has paved the way for research in this field. So I invite Alan here to deliver his opening lecture for our conference, and we will have time then for discussion based on his presentation before the report had been presented. So, Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tito, for that very kind, perhaps too kind, introduction. As he mentioned, I've been talking about monopsony for a very long time, and I'm not sure actually I've got anything particularly new to say about it. So apologies to those who've heard me talk about this before, that you know, I'm not sure how much you're going to learn. That, together with what I think is probably the most impressive lighting I've ever spoken in front of, means that I feel a bit like this sort of aging rock star playing playing his greatest hits, or perhaps his only hit from the past. Yeah, that's me living the dream, I guess. Okay. So first of all, I'm going to sort of give a very, broad introduction. So, what is monopsony? Now, literally, monopsony just refers to the case where there is a single buyer of something, not necessarily labour, but today I'm just going to talk about labour markets. But the term is just used more generally, more loosely, to refer to the situation where employers have some market power over their workers. Though the actual ability to exercise that power may be limited by laws, regulations, and institutions, as I'll talk a bit about. Now, the history of monopsony is an old idea. It was introduced by Joan Robinson in 1933, but for many years, few economists really paid much attention to it. So recently, there has been a sort of resurgence of interest in this. For example, earlier this year, the Biden administration issued a report on labour market competition. In the screenshot there, just in the bottom right, you can sort of see, I think, Janet Yellen, the Attorney General, C.C. Rouse, who's the chair of the Economic Advisors, the Labour Secretary, sort of chairing a meeting in which the other people are sort of for workers, talking about the ways in which employers had treated them not very well. So it's sort of risen up the political agenda certainly in the US, in other countries a bit, but probably rather less in many. Now, why has there been this recent resurgence of interest in this? Well, I think from the 1980s on, it was common to argue that we needed to just simply deregulate labour markets. In the UK, that was associated with Margaret Thatcher, in the US with Reagan, but it's sort of that view sort of was spread more widely. And the key to that was the idea that essentially an unfettered labour market, an unregulated labour market, was going to be a very competitive labour market. And so it was market competition alone that was sufficiently strong to protect workers' interests. But obviously the outcomes in terms of labour market outcomes have been disappointing in many countries. We've had sluggish overall productivity growth. We've in a number of countries had decoupling of labour cost growth from productivity growth, so a falling labour share. We've also had, even amongst workers, a decoupling of labour cost growth from median wage growth, so rising wage inequality. And what that means is that the current system, economic system, is just simply not working well for many. In that situation, it's really not surprising if people to start looking elsewhere for alternatives that they think might be better for them. And so it's really important that you can offer, a market system, an economic social system that works for everybody. And you know, part of the problem is that, you know, the labour market may simply not be as competitive as many people believed. I should add that also I think one reason for resurgence of interest is I think the financial crisis, although nothing to do with labour markets, you know, was quite a blow against the view that markets could not fail, because that was such an obvious, glaring example of market failure. So, you know, why do we think that employers have market power over their workers? Well, the first reason is frictions. It takes time and money to change jobs. The second reason is that jobs are always sort of idiosyncratic in some way. It might be a convenient commute or hours. You might not get on with the boss or your other workers, things like that. And then some of those things, I think, are in some sense inevitable. Although you can reduce frictions, you'll never be able to eliminate them. The idiosyncrasy in job, you're never going to be able to eliminate that. But then we might be more concerned that employers may actively restrict competition, either by collusion or other competitive, anti-competitive practices. And we'll sort of, you know, here's some example, you know, the other papers today will talk about that in much more detail than I will. And the bottom line is that if you imagine a situation in which an employer cuts wages by 1 cent, they'll probably find it harder to recruit and retain workers a little bit. But it's not going to be the case that the workers are going to be immediately quit, as the sort of economist sort of idealized model of perfect competition implies. So in terms of economic jargon, you know, the labour supply curve to the employer is not infinitely elastic. And in some sense, how elastic that labour supply curve is gives us a measure of how much market power they have. Just as when we think about the product market, we think that the market power of a monopoly depends on how sensitive demand for its product is to its price. So in my mind, you know, monopsony is simple common sense, but I think it's fair to say that at least within the academic community, it's had not had many buyers until recently. I mean, my favourite way to sort of illustrate this is an example from a British survey, which at the end of the survey asks people just a completely open question about, well, tell us what was the most important thing that happened to you in the past year. And the most common sort of event that people talk about are related to family. It's sort of births, marriages, divorce, deaths, those things, unsurprisingly. But the second most important category is employment. It's about getting a job. It's about losing a job. It's about getting a promotion, and so on. And so this tells us that employment, you know, jobs are a really big deal for people. They're not just sort of lying, or good jobs are not just lying all over the place. Absolutely no one ever says, well, I used to shop at this supermarket and now I shop at another supermarket as a major life event. But jobs are really up the top. A lot of people, I should also notice, say absolutely nothing of any note happened to them in the previous year. So over the time that I've been interested in monopsony, you know, the questions have changed. So the question really everyone will be asking would be, well, do employers have any monopsony power at all over their workers, with a considerable degree of skepticism? But now the questions, many more people, I think, are open to the possibility that employers have some monopsony power. And the questions are, how much monopsony power? How does it vary? What are the consequences of it? And what should we do about it? And the papers today we're going to hear later, make important contributions to that agenda. But basically, you know, I think everyone who's sort of looking at this with an open mind is finding that labour markets are simply not perfectly competitive. I don't think we should be at all surprised about that. You know, both experimental and observational studies find that labour supply to individual employers is not perfectly elastic. I mean, some of these studies sort of surprise even me. So, for example, you know, there's one study that compares Uber drivers with drivers who work for both Uber and Lyft. So two sort of competing ride-sharing companies. And to shift from one employer to another, they just have to press a button in their car. They just have to pay attention to one app and not the other. And yet we find that when there was sort of random variation in the wages offered by Uber, you didn't, you know, you still see not that much shifting from Uber to Lyft, even though for those workers that was very easy. And so David Card, in his lecture that he gave earlier this year called Who Set Your Wage, he sort of argued that there's perhaps a consensus settling on the view that the labour supply elasticity is in the region of 4 to 5, but there's still a lot to be done about that. So that obviously implies that employers have considerable potential market power, but whether they can use that depends upon how wages are determined. And I think for me, one of the advantages of the monopsony approach is that it encourages us to focus on firms to understand wage determination. So I think, too often economists have assumed that wages are sort of just determined by impersonal market forces in some mysterious manner, or there is some, bargaining between worker and firm which conveys the impression that the workers and firms are essentially just equal, or ignores the fact that employers typically have many more workers than workers have employers. So in some sense, the employers are, they're more practiced, they're more professional. It's sort of a situation of professionals versus amateurs. If I want to give a specific example of that, most employers would employ some lawyer in order to draw up employment contracts. It's worth it for an employer because they have, typically many workers, so incurring that fixed cost is worth for them. But almost no workers would take any legal advice on the labour employment contract that they're about to sign because it simply isn't worth their while. So firms have the greatest say in wage determination, and we need to focus on their incentives. And because there are, they do have market power, the firm's incentives is to pay below the competitive wage. But of course, firms don't set wages in a vacuum. They're going to be maybe institutional restrictions, minimum wages, collective bargaining, antitrust laws, restriction on legal employment contracts. There is competition for workers with other firms. Although that competition isn't perfect, there is obviously some competition. So one has to also pay attention to that. Now, why does this matter? Why does this matter for economists? Well, it matters because, it implies that wages are going to be lower than the competitive wage. That we would expect is going to be bad for inequality because it redistributes from labour to capital, and people who own capital tend to be better off than workers. But it's also going to be bad for efficiency because it's going to impede the allocation of workers to the most productive use. For me, it offers new perspectives on old questions, like the employment effect of the minimum wage. Does a minimum wage inevitably destroy jobs? On the gender pay gap related to, is the labour market for women less competitive than that for men? Penalties by ethnicity or race, the economics of immigration, the urban payback. And there's a long list of things that I think that once you adopt the sort of view that the labour market is monopsonistic to some extent, give you a new perspective. But I think it should also be not just of interest to academics, but also practitioners, because ultimately we need to intervene. Monopsony says we need to intervene in labour markets to ensure an appropriate balance of power between workers and employers. And if we don't intervene, basically it's one-sided in favour of employers. So I'll kind of just move on to talk a bit about what I think in very broad terms can be done about monopsony power, and talk through a number of different sort of policies, very high level. So first of all, there's sort of direct regulation of wages, minimum wages being the best example. Another approach is to establish, countervailing power to the monopsony power of employers. There's a more active competition policy to prevent firms from gaining labour market power. There's regulating the sort of things that are allowed in labour contracts, what is and is not allowed. And then there's simply policies to give workers more options, because basically maybe the biggest way to limit the market power of employers is to make the work relatively easy for workers to move to other employers. So I'll just talk about all of those in sort of someday. So minimum wages is a sort of classic, and I think a very useful policy. I've been in favour of minimum wage in the UK. 25 years ago in the UK, we didn't have a minimum wage. I was in favour of it then. But even myself, who's generally been in favour, I've been continually surprised by how high you seem to be able to push the minimum wage without clear job losses. I do think there is some level at which job losses would would be likely to happen. So, I mean, the UK currently has a target for the national living wage of 2/3 of the median wage by 2024, when it sort of seems on track to go there. Sorry, that's the dog, is the side. It's very, as you know, it seems on track to go there, and so far the Low Pay Commission looking at it hasn't found any adverse employment effects. But the minimum wage, although useful, does have its limitations. It can only affect wages at the lower end of the labour market, and it may be the case that as you push the minimum wage higher and higher, the incentives for employers to find ways around it, avoidance strategies, increases. So you see employers moving workers from being employees to sort of bogus self-employment, and there isn't any minimum wage for the self-employed. There are fewer guaranteed hours, what in the UK labour market would be called 0-hour contracts, as employers become more concerned about limiting the number of hours that they actually paid for, and that may lead to sort of income volatility. Countervailing power. So this basically means bolstering trade unions or worker voice in firms. In a country like the UK, this has seemed very hard, because basically people just seem less likely now than in the past to see trade unions as a possible solution to their problems. So they don't really think in terms of collective action. Though it should be said that in the current environment, that is perhaps changing. I mean, we're seeing in the UK, levels of strike activity that we haven't seen for decades at the moment. And a lot of that strike activity is not pushed by union leadership from the top. It's coming up from the bottom. And, one possible explanation for that is that when inflation is low, as it has been for many years, in some sense, downward nominal rigidity is a considerable protection against your real wages falling. So that, and very few employers actually cut nominal wages. But when you have inflation of, pushing on 10%, if you have nominal wage growth of 0, well, that's a fall in real wages of 10%. And so employers, workers need some lever to put on employers in order to protect their real wages. So it may be that we're entering a period in which we see something of a resurgence in trade unions. So the next sort of strand of policies one might use to do is sort of competition policy. So in most countries, the laws treat labour and product markets symmetrically in principle when it comes to evaluating anti-competitive practices, but in practice, they don't treat them symmetrically at all. And this is what has been called the historic imbalance. In fact, there are hardly any cases in many countries in which the competition authorities have invested, until very recently, investigated sort of labour market competition issues. And I think the book actually that I was reading on the flight when I was coming here yesterday, Eric Posner's book, How Antitrust Failed Workers, is a great summary. I read that book and I thought, I wish I could write as well as this. And certainly if you're kind of, not an economist particularly, that is, I think, a great summary of, what has happened, of monopsony more generally, and why competition policy may have failed workers. So that is changing a bit. So the US is committed to examining mergers, for labour market and not just consumer consequences. For example, there's some evidence that hospital mergers, reduce wages because if, for example, you're a nurse, there may be really, only one hospital, a handful of hospitals in your area. Those are the main employers, potential employers for you. We're also going to hear later, that labour markets seem very, concentrated, more concentrated. I mean, I've worked on monopsony for a very long time, but that book that Tito referred to in his introduction, I didn't look at labour market concentration at all, because it actually didn't occur to me that if you did, you would find that labour markets seemed very concentrated, and it took other people to point that out to me, but that's very important. And I think there's also the view that old-fashioned collusion, whether implicit or explicit, may be much more widespread than we think. And of course, that isn't really a new idea. There's a famous quote by Adam Smith that employers are always and everywhere in a sort of tacit but combination not to raise the wages of labour. And to violate this combination is everywhere a most unpopular action and a sort of reproach to a master among his neighbours and equals. And, he made a point, this is 250 years ago now, but I think it's still been very true, that we often hear about the combination of workers through trade unions and so on, the exercise of market power by unions, but almost nothing about the exercise of market power through the combination of masters, what he called masters, we would call employers. But as he said, whoever imagines that masters rarely combine is as ignorant of the world as of the subject. And, there have been some very prominent cases coming to light. I'll just talk a little bit about one of them, just to illustrate how, shockingly egregious some of the employer behavior has been. So this is what is known in the US as the sort of high-tech no cold calling case. It involved, a sort of intersecting web of agreements between companies, which are, many of which are household names. And, what the allegation was that they had agreements amongst each other, at the very least, not to proactively try and recruit each other's workers. And there's some suspicion that it went considerably further than that they wouldn't match wages that others offered, that they would even, simply not entertain people moving from one of these companies from the others. So, none of that, all of that was kept hidden from workers. So, for example, if you're a worker, you might think, oh, great, I've got a job at Google. This now means the experience I'll get means I will have, this will improve my chances of getting a job at Apple. Completely wrong. It actually meant when you got a job at Google, it reduced your chances of getting a job at Apple because of this agreement, which you knew nothing about. And the methods that they used to try and enforce this agreement, again, were quite shocking. So I'll just kind of give an example. So at one point, this is Steve Jobs. So then, he's head of Apple. And he's trying to recruit another company into this agreement, which was the company that made the older amongst you may remember the Palm Pilot. So this was a mobile phone company that no longer exists. And so, Mr. Jobs proposed an arrangement by which neither company would hire each other's employees. That the CEO of Palm told him, basically, I think, this is likely illegal, which actually I think he's right about that. And even if it isn't illegal, it's just wrong. At which point Steve Jobs basically sort of said, well, actually, we've also been looking at some of the patents in your mobile phone, and we think you might be infringing some of Apple's patents. And, the Palm CEO says, oh, no, I'm quite confident. And Steve Jobs basically said, yeah, but we could cost you a lot of money by, taking you to court and accusing you of this. And, that kind of behavior was, simply shocking. I think we've just assumed that this kind of stuff doesn't go on, but actually it does among companies that are sort of household names. So the other kind of approach is to another approach is to simply regulate contracts. And we're going to hear, for example, today about non-competes that restrict workers' future employment after leaving a firm. And, there's work, Evan is here as the person I think who's worked most on this, that, these reduced wages, even if many of these clauses are legally unenforceable, but, again, because workers don't have a lawyer telling them this is unenforceable, the worker doesn't know that. And we have sports from these, the impacts of these wide range of labour markets, including, sort of Brazilian football. There's a case ongoing at the moment involving the UFC, mixed martial arts, and so on. And, we're going to hear about that today for Italy. And I think one way to think about this in general is that is one way in which employers are actively trying to appropriate the human capital of workers. Increasingly, value in our economy is based around knowledge and information, and that is ultimately in people's people's heads, and that is what is valuable. And so employers are trying to basically appropriate that capital, and non-competes are one way of doing that because that's the way they can make money. But non-compete's not the only example. So, for example, if you're a gig economy worker working on a platform, your rating is incredibly important to, for example, how much business you get. If you hire an Uber and there was somebody with a 1-star rating, you're not going to, I suspect they don't get very much business. Now, who owns that rating? Well, you might think it's, it's the property of the worker. It's about how good and reliable that particular worker is, but that's not the legal situation. The legal situation is that those ratings are owned by the platform. And so if you wanted to leave Uber to go to someone else, you couldn't take your reputation with you. And that would then limit your ability to move to other firms. So there are a whole range of issues around that I think we need to be thinking about. And then very more broadly, I think we need to be rethinking freedom of contract. So economists make very widespread use of the idea that if two parties voluntarily agree a contract, the presumption is that they both gain from that contract relative to not signing it. But I think we should really question that idea. I'm a labour economist. When we talk about, say, the determination of wages, we often assume that people differ in their ability. For example, to explain why some people earn higher wages than others. But in much of economics, not except in behavioural economics, we assume that everyone is 100% fantastic at looking after their own interests, maximising their utility. And it's just not very plausible. And I think, particular concern is this point I mentioned earlier, that labour markets are one sort of market where often we have amateurs meet professionals. And, the professionals just have an advantage over the amateurs. And, so when it comes to employment contracts, labour workers, often probably not reading the small print, not really understanding it, even if they do it. It's all in sort of legal gobbledygook, which, may even be the purpose because so the workers don't know what they're changing. And so we need to worry about, all of that. Then I think there are also simply policies to give workers more options. And one way to do that is just to run the labour market hot. In the belief that intensifies competition for workers among employers, and that will sort of, more competition means higher wages, less market power. We're sort of seeing an experiment about that policy at the moment, although I find reading what's happening currently in labour markets a little bit challenging, actually. But, in a lot of countries where sort of the labour market seems tight, vacancies very high, historic highs relative to unemployment. But actually we see, wages actually in a number of countries, you see lots of complaints about shortages, but you don't see in some countries, seemingly, I haven't looked at the data in great detail, enormous upward pressure on wages. And certainly, in the UK, I get the impression that employers have simply got out of the habit of using wages to, compete with each other for workers. And, so the last thing they want to do to address labour shortages is raise wages for everybody, because that's kind of expensive. So it may be that the current situation is temporary or more permanent. It's certainly true that employers really hate competition. I spent some time as chair of a UK committee sort of on migration-related issues, and I had to talk to a lot of employers, and I recall at one meeting, the employers were very concerned about what was happening when the UK left the EU and free movement ended. And one of the employers said, well, if we get rid of free movement, we'll have to compete with each other for workers. And everyone, all the employers around the table nodded their head and agreed that would be an absolutely terrible thing if they had to compete for workers. And I sort of ventured rather cautiously the idea that it might be good for workers, but they weren't very interested in that. So that's one possibility, run the labour market hot. Another is, simply better information about job opportunities. Employers, in the contracts they force workers to sign, the impression is that they're seeking to restrict the flow of information. They often impose salary secrecy rules. The LSE employment contract has a salary secrecy rule in it. Through non-disclosure agreements that you're not really allowed to talk to, about the terms of your employment. That's incredible. You imagine a supermarket saying, well, you're not allowed to talk to anyone about what the price of bread is in a supermarket, but that's legally, you're not allowed to buy bread unless you agree to that. It's unthinkable. Why are we allowing this kind of stuff? And so the idea here is just ultimately, we're going to make it easier want to make it easier for workers to change jobs. But I think, we've got to realize it's never going to be completely easy to change jobs. I mean, I think there's always going to be, it's quite a big thing for people. And one theme I sort of want to come back to that I sort of talked about in a number of areas, that I do think the question more generally, I'm talking about labour markets, but actually it's broader than that, is who owns and uses information and data is increasingly important. We've basically had an explosion in the amount of data available and the ability to process it. And that data can be used for good or bad. And we need to make sure that we have frameworks which it is used for good. And I think the risk is that at the moment that if we don't sort of think about this enough, it's going to increase the powers of employers relative to workers. Who owns data is a really kind of important question, and also who it uses, but also how it uses matters. And so we need to make sure that information and data is as freely available to workers as it is to employers. Okay, so what does all this mean as the implications for designing policy? I think, I think one of the main points, I don't have a detailed prescription for what policy should be. I think policy in this kind of area, and a lot of things, can be quite complicated. Policies that improve one margin might conceivably make things worse in another. But the basic problem is that we've never really in the past asked any of these questions about are employers colluding, what is the form of employment contracts. So what we're trying to find is an appropriate balance of powers in employers and workers. I think you can go too far in the other direction. You could give workers too much power. And some of this may be complicated, but the point is that we should be trying, and we haven't been trying really at all. So I think I'll just kind of finish. I've no idea how I'm doing for time, but we all right? And then some time for questions. I'll talk a bit more about what I see as a sort of selection of open research questions in a more academic sense. So I'll talk about, how we should measure monopsony power, how it varies across segments in the labour market, and why. Employers have monopsony power, but how much they use, where do the monopsony profits go, transmission mechanisms, and things like that. So I think the issue of what's the best way to measure monopsony power, I think that's, there are a number of possible measures out there. So there's concentration ratios. The paper today is going to talk about these. But even once you've decided I want to use concentration ratios, you have to define a labour market by geography, industry, occupation. What's the right way in which you should do that? Should you compute concentration ratios on vacancies or employment? There are a lot of questions there. Also, where, we observe there's a lot of variation in concentration ratios, but where does that variation come from? So I think there's a lot there to be done. Another approach looks at, how sensitive are separation rates to wages. That typically is coming from a perspective which every separation is a voluntary separation, the worker deciding, that they want to leave the firm. But actually, we sort of know there are involuntary separations as well, so how should we think about those is, I think, an open issue. And one, work I've been working on recently is about looking at the other side. How sensitive is recruitment to wages? Often people use this sort of rule of thumb that separations and recruitment should have a similar wage elasticity, but, do they actually in practice? How much monopsony power do employers actually use? So, for example, I'm sort of working, again, with some German co-authors on this, like, if you have a, and the paper today takes concentration ratio as a measure of monopsony power and then looks for evidence that this affects wages. And, but one can do that with other measures and saying, well, is the transmission from concentration ratios or separations, the elasticity to wages, is it bigger or smaller than what you might expect from the theory? I think another question is, where do monopsony profits go? I mean, I think we often assume that they simply end up in the pockets of employers as profits. And, that in some sense isn't good, I don't think, but it may be worse that they're simply just frittered away in the form of inefficiency. They may be wasted in the rent-seeking activities of employers. The fact that monopsony rents in a labour market encourages firms otherwise relatively unproductive to enter those sectors. Monopsony makes it hard to allocate workers to the most productive use. And it may also be that productivity may respond to wages than the other way around. So there's some very interesting work by the authors that I've put up here, which show that look at what is the effect of raising wages on the productivity of workers, finding that in a way, although we normally think it's in a sort of very rather loose way, productivity determines wages, that in that particular case, there's also an important flow in the other direction. So it may be that the consequences of monopsony are, it's conceivable that they're not, it does have effects on, what wages, it lowers wages in large part because it lowers productivity, makes our economy less efficient. The next sort of issue that I think is kind of interesting is the transmission mechanism of shocks to workers. So there's a growing literature on the pass-through of sort of employer-specific shocks to wages, about how a firm's, demand for a firm's products affects that wages ways, but it actually is very likely that a bigger influence is the wages of competitor firms. And we have a much smaller amount of research on that. We have a few papers, but I think there could be a lot more. And, that's becoming actually extremely pertinent now, because we're interested for the first time in, half a century really, in the possibility of wage price spirals. And a lot of that is about how, shocks, if wages go up in one part, some set of firms in the labour market, how that transmits through other firms. And I think we don't know so much about that. I think there are other ways in which firms adjust employment. So a lot of monopsony models assume basically the wage is the only instrument available for firms to adjust wages, and it's not clear that can really explain all the regularities in the labour market. For example, in reality, there are other dimensions employers can use. They can try and recruit workers more or less intensively. They've also almost certainly got a worker quality margin as well. Again, the standard monopsony model assumes that an employer accepts every worker who says they want to work for them. In practice, we know that's not the case, that employers say no to workers who apply to jobs. So they've got, that's, a sort of essentially making a decision that worker isn't high enough quality. So there's a worker quality dimension. And, again, we need to do more about that. I think Beata, who's certainly was in the list of participants, I can't actually see the audience here, so that does make you feel like a rock star, has got some recent work on that. Okay. So I'll just sort of wrap up, and then maybe there's some time for questions, if that's okay. So the relationship fundamentally between employers and workers is not one of equals. Employers naturally have some market power, and we need to take that seriously. We need to intervene to ensure appropriate balance of power, both efficiency and equity, reasons for wanting to do that. Finding effective forms of intervention may be hard in some of these areas. It's not immediately obvious what is the right thing to do, but that's not a reason not to try. But there's still a lot of work to be done, and I'm optimistic because others seem to have so many ideas about what to do. So I think every Monday morning I get a list of the latest NBER working papers, and I think 3 this morning, at least tangentially, were sort of about monopsony. I read the abstracts and I think, I wish I'd thought of But I didn't. So, there's so much energy and creativity out there that makes me optimistic for the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan, for this very broad and comprehensive overview of issues related to monopsony power. Indeed, we are very far away from the competitive labor market case where wages equate the reservation wage of workers to the marginal productivity of a job, and therefore losing a job is not a big deal, and losing a worker for the employer is also not a big deal. You introduce the topics that will be discussed today. In the morning we will have a presentation on non-compete agreement, and in the afternoon we will instead be looking at the cross-country evidence on concentration ratio. I think, after this rock star presentation, and we can turn the light on, and we can have some discussion already now on some of the issues raised by Alan. A couple of considerations, if I may. One is that I think more work is warranted on the relationship between monopsony and working conditions, in particular work injuries, and so there has been a lot of work, more and more work after the seminal work done by the book by Alan Manning on the relationship between monopsony and wages, but not that much on working conditions. Possiamo accendere le luci, per favore? And the second consideration relates to the link between product and labor market, because there I think there are very important issues to be discussed. There are some that are important on a descriptive, in terms of descriptive accuracy, and the others are more relevant in terms of policy implication. On the descriptive accuracy, I think that the fact that many studies on minimum wage hikes didn't find significant employment losses, in some cases even employment gains, has been in a way interpreted as evidence of monopsony power. But also some of the studies, while they find that there are no effect of minimum wage hikes on employment, they find that there is an effect on prices of the final goods. The two things are somewhat at odds, because in a way, if you have monopsony power, then you should expect to have an increase in a way on supply of goods rather than a decline. And so the fact that you have this pass through on prices, this increases in prices, is something that doesn't square so well with the evidence of monopsony. But there may be something there also in terms of the relation between monopsony power and monopoly power in the product market. And the second consideration is indeed related to the role that antitrust, as you said, should have in this field. Clearly, the case for antitrust to deal with no poaching agreements and collusion among employers is something that we will discuss also this afternoon, based also on the experience of the Portuguese antitrust competition authority. But I wonder whether, more broadly, antitrust should also worry about concentration of employers as well as non-competes, which typically belong more to the sphere of the relationship between employer and worker. So I would be interested in having your views. But before giving back the floor to you, I wonder whether there are questions from the floor. I think there is one here.
So thanks a lot. The presentation was already very broad. I was wondering whether you could say something about the relationship between technology, and I'm thinking in particular about the revolution in the last years with artificial intelligence, algorithmic economy, and the impact of monopsony, right? So on the one hand, you may think that it could help reducing monopsony power, right? For instance, by spreading information about compensation in different companies. I mean, there are nowadays many websites that diffuse this information, right, on compensation packages. But on the other hand, of course, this algorithm, they provide probably a very effective way of extracting more rents from workers. So probably the impact is ambiguous or maybe not so optimistic. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. So we have more questions. I think Andrea.
Somewhat related to this, the same you made the remark on paid transparency. So, but I think that this could be two-ended in a way. So on the one hand, yes, it's more information for workers on pay in other companies, but at the same time, it's also more information for companies to, let's say, coordinate wage setting without exchanging information, without doing anything proactively, but knowing what the others are doing and not giving 1 cent more. So there as well, maybe the issue is less obvious than it may appear.
Thank you. Are there other questions? We take another one and then I give the floor back to Alan.
Yes, my question was related to how monopsony power is increasingly being debated in antitrust laws. We know that there are some debates on how we should include these on merger assessment or damages, but also there's some concerns that the current debates in labor economists will be transferred to competition policy. And as an example, I can refer to the size of local labor markets. This is a current debate, and we know that some researchers have asked competition authorities to define rules of thumb of how labor markets should be defined. But we also know that by different studies, this normally underestimates the size of concentration. So what is better for you in this case? Should we define rules of thumb for competition authorities in order for them to to tackle these topics? Or is it better to make open questions? I know, for example, that South African competition authorities deal with this, making broad questions about whether mergers will damage workers' options of outside work, or how this will affect them on skills. What's for you is the best way to tackle these topics on competition?
A very last question, Claudio. And
I found very interesting the reference you made to the different margins that employers can have to exert monopsony power on labor cost. You mentioned some, bogus self-employment. Tito mentioned working condition. There are so many margins, like hours unpaid, working time. In Italy, it's very common that, workers are hired part-time and they are asked to work full-time. It's so difficult to, vigilate and monitor. The costs are huge. What do you think about this? Labor contracts often are not enough, even collective contract.
well, many questions. I don't know if you have time to answer all of them in detail, but we will have the entire day to discuss this issue, so you will come back also.
So let me take about, technology. If I give the specific example, I won't take them in order. I'll try and come back to each of them. So if one takes the issue of sort of pay transparency, that's one of the issues where I think if you it sounds like, well, that should be better, but actually, the way things unfold might be different. I'll give a very specific example. So some time ago, quite a long time ago in the UK, there was concern about the level of sort of senior executive pay, and they said, well, we need to make this, transparent. And so then, in some sense, that will lead to lower executive pay because people will be outraged and the executives will be somewhat embarrassed. But what actually happened, that there was pay transparency. Some senior executives suddenly realized, actually, I'm one of the badly paid ones. They started lobbying for, higher pay, and the outcome actually probably was that executive pay actually went up. So all of this is kind of quite complicated, but I think there's no doubt that firms are using technology at the moment to improve, their information they have about what other firms pay and things, or, AI will be sort of one of those, tools they're using, and kind of workers are not. And I just think fundamentally that can't really end well. And we need public intervention, because any individual worker can't really, it's not worth their while to set this up, whereas the employers, being more concentrated, find it more. So I think we need to think about all of those things. And sometimes you don't know what's going to work. You've just got to experiment with it. But, not knowing what works isn't an excuse for doing nothing. In terms of the question about antitrust, I think, a good question is what you can sort of read across from product market antitrust, what is going to be the same, and then you just sort of read it, translate it, on what is different. And I think there are sort of differences. So, one example is labour markets tend to be much more local than most product markets. So, that's a challenge for antitrust authorities, because they're used to dealing with, intervening in big cases. Whereas what you may be faced with in labour markets is lots and lots of little cases. They may add up to a lot, but the effort of investigation is basically a fixed cost. And so that's sort of a challenge about how you actually do that. So I think, again, this is something I just keep repeating myself, which is just, I don't know for sure, but I think we should be trying to think about it. I think the concern that Claudio has about, you can monitor one aspect of employment contracts, but the consequence is that, something undesirable happens in some other dimension. That's a sort of a serious, that is a serious, serious concern. I think to date in the UK, it's not such a serious concern that, for example, it would make me worry about, having the minimum wage, pushing the minimum wage up. But it is something that, I think we kind of need to be looking at. But again, it's sort of, in a way, all comes down to information about what is actually happening. But sometimes this, in the employment relationship, this is all happening sort of in private between employers and workers. There's a sort of inevitable difficulty in doing that.
So thank you so much, Alan. I'm sure we will have time today to go back to many of these issues. So once more, thank you for your great introduction to our discussion today. So now the chair will be with Paolo Pinotti, and we will start with the first presentation.
Is this for me?
Yes.
So, welcome again. So, thanks again for the opening lecture to Alan Manning. And now we move right away to the presentation of the first report by the team, the research team led by Andrea Garnero from the OECD, who is here to present the result of their work. And this is joint work also with Tito Boeri from Bocconi University and the Fondazione Debenedetti, and Lorenzo, Giovanni, Luisetto from the University of Trento. And so you have like 1 hour and a half, including the discussion, so please try to stay within 1 hour at most, or even if we want to leave some more time for questions. And then, in any case, after the discussion, we're going to have another half an hour for questions from the public. Floor is yours. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Paolo. Thanks a lot to all of you. And so I'm going to present for the first time the first results of this survey and the work we did on non-compete clauses in Italy together with Tito and Lorenzo. They will join me after for to answer to your questions. So in my talk, I will first briefly introduce the topic, then provide you at least the main intuition and main ideas of how non-compete clauses are regulated in Italy. Then I will briefly describe you how we run the survey, and then have a substantial discussion of the main results. It will be essentially descriptive work, but I think the first goal of this work was to establish whether non-compete clauses are an issue, are used or not, and how they are used in Italy. And then I think more work can be done and more work should be done to see what is the effect of non-compete clauses in the Italian case. So there are many sources of monopsony power. You heard Alan Manning just before. Non-compete agreements can be one of the sources of monopsony power. The definition, what is a non-compete agreement or non-compete clause, you will see often in the slides NCC, so NCC are non-compete clauses. They are a contract or a clause of a contract where an employee agrees not to compete with an employer, with her own employer, after the employment time period is over. So it's a clause that covers the post-employment activity. So usually a non-compete clause is justified as a way to protect trade secrets and specific investments in, like training. So the company is providing specific costly training, or the worker has access to some trade secrets, and so the company has the right and the incentive to protect itself with a non-compete clause. So in this case, if non-compete clauses are used essentially to protect trade secrets and costly investments in the worker, we should expect that essentially workers with trade secrets and high skills and specific training needs are covered by such clauses. But in fact, non-compete clauses can also be used to restrict labor market competition by restraining the ability of workers to look for another job with a competitor, and maybe to ask for a pay rise, even not taking up the job, but just simply say, oh, I've been offered another job, a better job, raise my salary. But they can also be used to restrict product market competition by restricting firms' entry in the market, so new competitors, either former employees setting up their own company and therefore becoming a competitor, or a competitor coming in the market and hiring workers from the company. In this case, non-compete clauses are more widespread, not limited to high-skilled workers, workers with access to trade secrets, and not necessarily associated to higher wages and training, because in the first cases, the idea is that both parties are better off. So the company is protected, but workers do get a compensation, higher wages, and maybe some other perks in exchange. So in a way, it's possible to test these competing hypotheses empirically looking at the data. In the US, Evan, Starr, and colleagues have done a great deal of work, and they have shown that non-compete clauses are widespread and also cover low-wage and low-skilled workers with negative effects on wages at the bottom. So the first hypothesis is certainly not the only one. There must be more than that. There is very little evidence for the European Union, let's say EU countries, and none for Italy. So in this report, what we do is that we provide the first comprehensive panorama of the regulation and the use of non-compete clauses, first by analyzing the regulatory framework, so the law, collective agreements, and the case law, and then providing the first empirical evidence based on a novel survey of 2,000 private sector employees. A brief summary of the US, maybe Evan will say more, but just to say that this is indeed an issue, at least on the other side of the Atlantic. There has been recently, but also some years ago already, a significant literature on non-compete clauses, both measuring the incidence but also exploiting, lucky the US, you can always have discontinuities to exploiting the differences in enforceability and regulation across states. So Evan and Kotos have shown that 18% of private sector and public health workers are bound by non-compete clauses, and 38 have agreed to one in the past. Colvin and Shields, for a report for the Economic Policy Institute, have a significantly higher share, but it's a company-level survey. So whereas Evan asks employees, like we do, Colvin and Shields ask employers or human resource people, asking, are your workers covered, all workers, part of the workers? So they estimate between 28 and 46% of private sector workers covered by a non-compete clause. Certainly, other papers have shown that non-compete clauses are not confined to high-skilled workers. Johnson's and Lipsitz has found 30% among hairstylists, and less than half have access to trade secrets. And then other papers exploiting these discontinuities have shown that higher enforceability of non-compete clauses is associated with lower job mobility, lower wages, and then there can, this at the individual level, and then there can be also aggregate effect, as we were saying before, in terms of the idea of a non-compete clause is to protect, at the end of the day, innovation, investment in innovation. But in fact, there are papers that found fewer knowledge spillovers and the risk of brain drain. So people, inventors going from states that do not enforce or enforce less non-compete clauses, escaping from states where these are more enforced. To the research work, there's also been significant policy discussion and action. I'll be very brief, maybe Evan will say more, but in 2016, Obama proposed a ban for certain categories. In last year, Biden signed an executive order which, among other things, encouraged the Federal Trade Commission to ban or limit non-compete clauses. And then there has been quite some action at state level. As I said, there are significant differences. For instance, in California, since more than a century, non-compete clauses are not enforceable, not allowed, but more recently other states have introduced limitations to the duration or entirely banned, or introduced limitations, for instance, in Illinois below a certain wage threshold. So in the US, the issue has become quite rapidly a significant issue. In Europe, as I said, we know much less. In Austria, since 2006, non-compete clauses have been banned. They are not possible for low-wage workers, defined as of today, 3,480 euros, so not so low, per month, of course. And there is a nice study now, a nice work, piece of research by Young, that shows that this ban increased mobility among low-wage workers, but not wages. Then there is some more scattered evidence on the incidence in other countries. In the Netherlands, about 19%, 11% without the secondary education. In Finland, this is a survey just among high-skilled professionals, so it's much higher, 37%. In Denmark, there is also different pieces of evidence from trade unions. And finally, in the United Kingdom, there was at some point, a couple of years ago, a consultation, a public consultation of the government on proposals to reform non-compete clauses, but there has been no news since that initiative, so we don't know if the government still intends to do something or not on the issue. So we'll now provide you a quick summary of the Italian regulatory framework. As the Italians in the room certainly know, there are different layers of regulation in Italy, that they go from the law to collective agreements to the case law. So we have analyzed all three dimensions. In terms of the law, before 1942, non-compete clauses in Italy were not allowed. Since 1942 in the Civil Code, it's possible to restrict post-employment activities, but non-compete clauses must abide to a certain to a number of, let's say, requirements. So first, to be based on a written contract, so it cannot be an oral agreement. Second, they must define a compensation for the non-compete clause. So the non-compete clause must come in exchange for something to the worker, for money to the worker. Third, it must be limited in scope in terms of sectors covered, so it cannot cover the entire economy. In time and area. And in time is the only area where the law provides some details, because otherwise it's fairly coarse. It doesn't say much, let's say. So it must be limited to 5 years for executives and 3 for others. So still relatively a long period. Collective agreements in Italy can play and do play a significant role in regulating labor market and employment contracts in many areas. For instance, there can be, they can regulate how many temporary contracts can be used in the sectors and so on, and other things, not just pay scales. But on this very specific topic, they play practically no role. We have looked into there are almost 1,000 collective agreements in Italy. We looked at the 44 collective agreements that cover 87% of the employees, private sector employees in Italy. So let's say the large majority, the biggest collective agreements, and we found no mention of non-compete clauses in the text of these agreements that can be very long and cover different dimensions. We then looked at collective agreements that are specific to managers, so these are usually very small collective agreements, and only 3 of them do mention non-compete clauses, but they add little to the provisions of the law. So they add minor specifications, but they do not provide more details on how the non-compete clause should be used, even for managers. So this means that at the end of the day, much is left to courts to decide case by case, if they are called to decide. And the Court of Cassation, so is the highest court and certainly in the civil procedure in Italy, has given the general principle a few years ago that the non-compete clause cannot excessively compress workers' future employment opportunities. So courts should judge the fairness of the clause by trying to understand whether it is excessively compress future opportunities or not. Of course, this is very somewhat qualitative and not clear-cut what is excess. So we try to define which cases are most likely, in which cases non-compete clauses are most likely unenforceable, and in which cases there must be a case-by-case evaluation. So certainly if the duration is above set in the law, the clause is not enforceable. Also, if the duration is not specified, so a duration must be specified, it must be lower than 3 years or 5 years, but there must be something. The sectoral scope, again, if it is not specified or if there is a blanket exclusion. So in some other jurisdictions, it's possible to have the so-called garden leave, so where workers are sent home, they continue to receive their wage, but they are asked to do no work whatsoever, and hence the reference to tending the garden. So they cannot work, they just have to take care of the house and the garden. But in Italy, it's not possible. So this is excessively compress future employment opportunities because you can do no work at all. In the geographical scope, again, if it is not clearly defined, but it can be small or very wide. Same for compensation. The compensation must be defined. But at the same time, as I already said, even a high compensation, such as a 100% compensation, so a full salary, but to do no work, is not allowed. So again, you see that the different items in any case have to be evaluated one together with the others. And finally, in some jurisdiction, it may be possible to withdraw over the course of the employment contract. So you sign the contract, there is a non-compete clause at the beginning, and then over the course of the employment contract, maybe at the end of the employment contract, when the employee finally is going to another employer, but not in direct competition with its former company, the company may say, okay, but it's okay, you can go, I'm not going to pay you the compensation. No, this is not allowed in Italy. If since the beginning there's the non-compete clause, then the non-compete clause is applicable to both parties, and therefore none can withdraw during the course of unilaterally withdraw during the course of the employment relationship. There are some cases on the other end when courts, and these are, let's say, most cases, when courts have to decide on a case-by-case basis. So, as I said, the sectoral scope cannot be too large, but what is too large is not defined. So there are cases, you will see in the results of the survey, where the non-compete clause applies only to the municipality, but there are cases that have been upheld in courts, so not just in the survey, but we know from case law that they have been confirmed, that the non-compete clause covers the entire European Union. So even the entire European Union can be covered by the clause in terms of the geography. Same for sector, in the sense it cannot cover the entire economy, but it can cover a very narrow list of sectors, occupations, or maybe even specific companies, but it can also be larger than that. And for the compensation, there can be issues when the compensation, in some cases, the compensation is paid one-off at the end of the employment relationship. So the employment relationship ends and the employee gets the stated compensation. In other cases, the compensation is part of the salary. In this case, it's trickier because if the employment relationship is very short, only a few weeks or a few months, maybe the compensation is not, but then the non-compete clause, for instance, in duration, geography, and sectoral scope is very big, then the compensation is too small compared to the limitations that it imposes. And therefore, in these cases, courts may say that it's not fair, not proportionate. In the past, there was some references to at least 10% of the salary, at least in terms of the monthly salary, but it's not a unanimous and clear reference, so we cannot say that this is a criteria that is always used. So these criteria have to be assessed together on a case-by-case basis. But in any case, let's say the cases that go to court are only a limited part of what happens in the economy, and usually linked to more high-skilled workers. So I will now briefly describe the survey design. So in the second part, we try to build on the analysis of the regulatory framework to analyze and measure how many workers are effectively covered, bound by a non-compete clause in Italy. So we hired a survey company to run a survey of 2,000 private sector employees aged 16 plus in Italy, using a panel, drawing from a panel of 150,000 active members, broadly representative of the Italian population. So we restrict our sample to private sector employees, dropping therefore unemployed, inactive people, and too young or older people not working. And we stratify our survey by age and gender, together, and geographical area using data from ISTAT. And then, so this is the main representative sample that we use to measure the incidence of non-compete clauses and the characteristics of the workers covered by non-compete clauses compared to the rest of the population. Then, since we also want to analyze the content of non-compete clauses as well as how these non-compete clauses came about in the contract, so if they were negotiated or not, what was negotiated, what was the outcome of the negotiation, we also extend the sample to, let's say, we oversample workers with a non-compete clause to reach 1,000 respondents with the non-compete clauses, so to have more, let's say, variation and more information on workers with the non-compete clauses in total. So we have, let's say, a survey with two legs in a way. The survey was 21 minutes for respondents with a non-compete clause and 11 for those without, and respondents were rewarded with some points that after few surveys can be exchange with the vouchers to buy something, for instance. The questionnaire was cognitively tested and piloted before fieldwork. We are very grateful to Evan and co-authors because we draw a lot of inspiration from their work, but of course adapting it to the Italian case, the Italian legislation and the Italian labor market also on other dimensions. The fieldwork took place between May and June, and there were a number of real-time checks to ensure, let's say, good behavior, if you want, of the respondents. First of all, the link was individual, so only the invited person could respond to the survey, not someone else finding randomly the link online or other people responding with the same link multiple times. And then types of misbehaviors were identified, blocked, and sanctions. So those that go too fast, those that respond the same, especially matrices, so I don't know, they respond always 5, 5, 5, 5, 5 to everything, or the so-called epic clickers, so people that knowing that responding always 5, 5, 5 probably does not go through, they respond random numbers, but they are completely inconsistent, and that's, let's say, standard practice in online surveys to, let's say, keep some quality. Online surveys are nowadays widely used in market research for sure, but also in social science and academic research, but of course they do not go without challenges. So the main issue is that there is no proper, for this kind of online survey, there is no proper sampling frame like the labor force survey or the current population survey in the US would have, where people are completely, let's say, randomly out of the blue called to respond to the survey. So there is some selection. The first is that not the entire population in Italy for sure is online. However, we checked the latest data and we see that there is a strong age gradient. So in fact, for people that are more or less in the in working age, people are online. They use regularly internet in their life. So up to 89% among those in the labor force, so including employed and unemployed, do go online. So it's more of an issue for the 65 plus. However, in Italy, the average effective retirement age is about 63. So there are only a tiny share of people above 65 who are in the labor market, and usually these are relatively high-skilled people. The second issue is that not all internet, second potential source of bias is that not all internet users sign up to be on online panels. So this panel of 150,000 people are people that volunteered to be part of the panel. So there must be some self-selection on willingness to respond to things or getting some rewards or just having nothing else to do and filling surveys online. However, there are no specific reasons to believe that they self-select because of their non-compete status, or because they self-selected because they had one or because they didn't have one. So this panel is built for very general purposes, mainly market research purposes, and there is no reference whatsoever to research in the labor market, specifically, say, general research on social research, or of course non-compete clause specifically. The third potential source of bias is general. It applies to all surveys, and it's increasingly a big issue. It's the non-response bias. So usually non-response rates are higher and higher, or response rates are lower and lower, not just in online surveys. So we got a 26% response rates, which is not huge, but is not small at all either. And of course, and importantly, a very good completion rate, because in the invitation to the survey there was no reference whatsoever to the content of the survey. So people could not self-select, saying, oh no, I don't want to respond to labor market issues or to non-compete clauses, or I want because I have one and I want to give my opinion. They didn't know what the survey was about. They were just invited to fill a survey, as they are regularly invited to do. But on the other end, when they opened the survey, at some point they could have understood what the survey was about, and they could have dropped off if they didn't like it, but they didn't. So 91% completed the survey once they opened the link. So we'll now turn to the results, first discussing the incidents, and then how the non-compete clauses are negotiated, how they come into the employment contract, then the content of the clauses, and then if I have time, I'll have two additional pieces of work, let's say mainly suggestive pieces of work on the link between non-compete clauses and labor market concentration, so trying to bridge the two sessions of today, and also a small focus on other restrictions specific to the Italian labor market. So on the incidents, so the main finding is that about 16% of Italian private sector employees are bound today by a non-compete clause. I don't know if you see the chart in full, but the question allowed to answer yes, I have a non-compete clause. I'm looking at the first bar. Yes, I have a non-compete clause in blue. Probably yes, I have one. Probably not. No, I don't have one, and I don't know. So there's quite some degree of uncertainty allowed, but still allowing people to say, yes, probably I have one. I seem to remember I have one, and the other saying, no, probably I don't have one. And you see that if we sum, so those that answered yes, and those, which is 8%, and those that answered probably yes, we get to 16% of private sector employees covered by a non-compete clause, with only, let's say, 4% saying prefer not to say or don't know. I didn't discuss this in advance, but of course, non-compete clauses are not the only clauses possible in an employment contract in Italy, like elsewhere, concerning post-employment activities or general, let's say, the behavior during the job. So we discussed already before with Alan Manning. So one of the most typical clause is the so-called non-disclosure agreement, NDAs. And indeed, in Italy, like in other countries, these are the most common clauses that can be found in an employment contract. You can see that about 39% of workers have some form of non-disclosure agreement with their company. So this is by far the most common clause. Then there are other clauses, less used than non-compete. So non-compete clauses come after, well after, but still after non-disclosure agreement. Clauses such as non-solicitation of colleagues, so that when you move to another company or whether you create a new company, you cannot call your former colleagues to work with you. Non-solicitation of clients, so basically stealing the former clients. A clause asking to repay training, so if you, especially for high-skilled, you do an MBA, the company is paying your MBA, and then you leave just after your MBA, thanks to the MBA itself, the company may ask you to repay the cost of the MBA, or similarly to repay bonuses and benefits that you got during your job, or the so-called pre-assignment agreement, where you pre-agree that any invention, discovery, patents will go to the company and not to yourself. So you see that there is a significant number of clauses, but non-compete clauses are the second one in terms of workers covered in the private sector in Italy. And these clauses often come in a bundle. So in this chart you see various combinations. So let's start from the right. You see that 55% of workers are private sector employees. I say workers, but these are private sector employees, are not covered by any of these clauses. So they are not covered by anything of what I mentioned before. The rest, 45%, have different combinations. So only 1% of workers are covered by a non-compete only. Whereas 19% of workers are covered by a non-disclosure only. The rest is covered by different combinations, typically non-compete, non-disclosures, and maybe something else in the 13%, or other combinations in the 12%. So you see that these clauses, which also makes them somehow not always easy to analyze then, especially in an empirical setting, come together. They are not taken in isolation. With the results of the survey, we also try to check whether there is any sign of an increasing use over time of clauses in Italy. So we basically checked the incidence of non-compete clauses by year of signing of the employment contract. So we see no sign of an increased use over time, contrary to Finland, where there is some sign of an increasing use over time, but it's only among high-skilled professionals in this case, in the case of Finland. Here we look at permanent workers, so the numbers are slightly different, but not very much. And if anything, we see a slightly higher incidence before 2000. Nevertheless, this exercise has some limitations because, of course, we are comparing different things, because before 2000 it's a very long contract, so people who have been at the same company for more than 20 years, whereas after 2010 are people with who had so far a shorter tenure, so we are not comparing apples with apples, so take it with many pinches of salt, but still no huge indication for sure that there is an increasing use over time in Italy. Which workers are bound by a non-compete clause? In the report, you will see the full, let's say, the full results, but instead of having too many numbers and tables, let's say the summary is that indeed, on average, non-compete clauses are, as, let's say, the traditional view of the non-compete, of the use of non-compete clauses would suggest, they are more likely among men, high educated, let's say, with relatively high salaries, employed in high-skilled occupations, in medium-large companies operating both in Italy and abroad, let's say, if you want, multinationals. However, they are not confined only to these workers, because it's fine that they are used among these workers, but they also use relatively extensively among workers who have not these characteristics. For instance, among workers with less than secondary education, the incidence of non-compete clauses is 9.4. Among workers earning less than 2,000 euros per month is 12%. In elementary occupations, which is so the lowest level of occupations at least in the ISCO categories, it's 13% the incidence of non-compete clauses. So you can see that yes, they are more used among high-skilled, high-paid workers, but they are still significantly present also in the rest of the working population. Moreover, as Evan has shown already for the United States, they are used also among people without access to trade secrets. I don't know if you see much from distance, but let's say here is a list of potential confidential information people have access to, development of new products, marketing goals, secret formulas, strategic plans, list of customers, list of contacts, and so on and so forth. And we see that among those who have access to this information, 19% have a non-compete clause to any of this information, one item of the list or all items. Among those that have no access to any of these items, and the list is pretty long, 9% are still covered by a non-compete clause. So in this, 9% of workers have a non-compete clause despite not having access to any type of confidential information. So then we ask how these clauses come into the employment contract. We ask employees, and so here we move to use the extended sample. We ask employees when they were informed about the presence of a non-compete clause in their employment contract. So most of employees discovered about the non-compete clause before beginning the job, either when signing the contract or even before signing the contract when they were first offered the job. But there is still a share of workers with the non-compete clause that discovered after, and maybe in exchange of nothing. Let's say, for instance, 6% of workers say that they got the non-compete clause without any change in their work. 4% says that they got it, but without a promotion or a pay rise, just a change in their task, maybe more responsibilities, but without a change in pay or their pay grade or the occupational level within the company. So you can see that most know before, but in some cases the non-compete clauses are introduced after without anything changing. And moreover, not everyone read it carefully, as Alan Manning said before. Not everyone, the first when we sign mobile phone contracts or else we read the fine prints. And also when people sign an employment contract, not necessarily they read the fine print. So 44% said that yes, they read it very carefully. Others say that they signed it after a quick read. 7% said that they signed it without reading it, and a few consulted friends or lawyers or specialized websites. So yes, a part of them read it carefully, but others didn't. It's also interesting to see that a very large majority of workers bound the non-compete clause did not try to negotiate it. So they took it as it was. 73% for various reasons. The first, because they thought that the terms were reasonable. The second is because they gave for granted that the clause was not negotiable, and maybe partly related to that, because not signing the clause would have built tensions with the new employer. So you start a new job, you are possibly enthusiastic and happy of getting this new job, you don't want to make a fuss from day zero and making a fuss about something that seems relatively minor. You may try to negotiate the wages, working time, you already have many things to discuss. Maybe non-compete clauses are not necessarily the most important. It's also interesting to see that many workers, many employees bound by a non-compete clause consider the non-compete clause justified. This is almost all managers who have a non-compete clause consider that their non-compete clause is justified. On the other hand, the share of workers considering as justified is much lower among elementary occupations, and you remember that 13 of them are covered. So only a third considers it justified for the work or other relatively low-skilled occupations. So you can see that non-compete clause come in the contract without much negotiation, and with most workers more or less silently accepting it as it is. We now turn to the content of the non-compete clauses. You remember that the civil code says little, but it says that the non-compete clause must be in written form, must have a compensation, set the sectoral scope, the geographical boundaries, and the time limitation. So we look into these items, and so we asked workers whether they have their non-compete clause includes a compensation or not, and this is one of the first very striking results, is that 42% of employees bound by a non-compete clause declared that their non-compete clause does not include a compensations. The rest have a compensation in various forms, as I said. It can be a fixed lump sum payment, let's say, at the end of the employment contract, or a monthly compensation with a minimum, or a monthly compensation without a minimum. But let's say the striking finding here is that 42% declare not to have a compensation, or at least not to be aware of having a compensation. And also, many appear not to specify a duration. You remember that there must be a time limit, and the time limit must be lower than 3 years for most of workers and 5 for managers. And 58% do not have or do not remember having a time duration. On the other hand, when there is a duration, the duration seems to be within the limits set of the law. So you see spikes here. Basically, it's 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and 5 years, and then few beyond that, but broadly speaking, for those who have a duration or at least remember it, the duration seems in line with the specification of the laws, but a huge number, as we have seen before, so 58%, have no specified time limit for the non-compete clause. The geographical scope, as I said, there is no indication in the law, and also the case law is not very precise in the sense it must be assessed against the compensation and the sectoral, together with the compensation and the sectoral scope of the clause. But you can see that it varies a lot. It can be the entire country, the entire Italian territory for 17% of employees, or just the municipality for 14%, but it can go up for a minority of workers, but still for 3.5% of private sector employees with the non-compete clause to the entire European Union. And still, also in this case, there are a number of workers, 14%, which have a clause which is generic and does not specify an area, or they don't remember. So the geographical scope can vary significantly from worker to worker, but most concern the same sector occupation. So mostly the clauses concern the same sector in which the company operates, or the same occupation of the worker, even in another sector. So if we take all these findings together and we trying to benchmark with respect to what is foreseen in the law and the case law, we see that a large share of non-compete clauses appear, let's say, between fishy and possibly suspicious, and at the end of the day, possibly unenforceable. Because if you don't specify a compensation, a time duration, the scope, and the geographical limits, the clause is simply null and void, and so it's not enforceable. So this is a pretty striking result, because if we find, if we take all these criterion together, up to 68% of clauses are not enforceable. So we try to test somewhat the robustness of this finding by restricting the sample. So we restrict the sample to workers who are sure to have signed a non-compete clause, so those that answered yes, and also to those that answered yes, and they say that they have read it very carefully. So people that, in principle, of course, they can still make mistake, forget, or say something wrong, but even when we restrict the sample, you see, so it's the green bar on the right, the most restrictive sample, you can see that still 57% of clauses appear not to entirely fulfill the minimum requirements established in the civil code. This may appear surprising, or you may think that it must be an Italian feature where things are not done properly, but in fact, even in the United States, maybe Evan will say more, we have strong evidence from different papers that non-compete clauses are used in employment contracts also in states that do not allow them. So in California and other states, non-compete clauses are not enforceable, and nevertheless, companies use them, and they say that you see that they use them when they answer to Evan, when employees answer to Evan, but even more surprisingly, when they answer to Colvin and Sherrills, the HR people or the employer, so the company itself says, yes, I'm using, I'm based in California, I'm under California law, and so in theory I know that I should not use them, but nevertheless I tell you that I'm using these non-compete clauses. So clearly there is the smell that in this case non-compete clauses, either in the US where they are using states where they are not possible, or in Italy when they are drafted in a way that is not enforceable, there must be some degree of mistake and maybe ignorance of how exactly they should be done, but also because maybe it doesn't really matter, because in any case what the main purpose is to discourage the worker to look for another job, rather than really then go to court and make it enforceable ex post. And indeed, what we find, we also ask people their perceived enforceability. So between 0 and 10, how much do you think that the company will enforce, will stop you to go from a competitor and go to court, and then the court will find you, let's say, liable because you breached the clause. And you see that there is basically no difference between those that have a clause that fulfill all the requirements in the law and those that have a clause that doesn't fulfill all the requirements on the law. So you see that on average 6 point something, 6.3, let's say the perceived risk of being brought to court and enforced by the employer is about 6.3 among both groups, and then between 6.4, 6.6, the perceived enforceability by the tribunal. So this matters because what matters at the end of the day is what workers think, not necessarily the actual enforceability of the clause, especially when people have little knowledge and little resources to go to court. And therefore, we may think that even non-enforceable clauses do have a behavioral effect, and this has been shown and proved in the United States, the so-called in Latin inter rorem effect. So people are they just fear and they just don't take the opportunity to test the employer or the court, and they just restrain and they don't move, don't ask for a wage increase because they know they can't. And again, this is not typical of Italy, it's not typical also of the labor market. There is a paper in the US who has shown that in the Boston area, I don't remember now, a huge percentage of rental lease contracts are not enforceable, but nevertheless people sign it, and maybe we sign it when we rent a car or when we do something else because we don't know and we maybe don't even read it. So if I still have a little bit of time, I'll quickly give you just an hint, also because honestly it's just, let's say, very first suggestive evidence on what could be the link between non-compete clauses and labor market concentration. So you have seen there are many sources of monopsony power, there are different streams of literature. So Andrea in the afternoon will tell you much more about the literature on labor market concentration that has been in a way burgeoning in the last few years. What could be the link with non-compete clauses? Because on the one hand, you could think that they are substitute. You don't need, if you are the only employer in town, you don't need a non-compete clause because people have nowhere to go. So there is no need to further add something that could also be not necessarily really enforceable if there are no competitors, or simply if there are less competitors. So a labor market is less concentrated. But remember that non-compete clauses can also be used to restrict product market competition. So even if you are the only employer in the market, with the spirit of better safe than sorry, you also add a non-compete clause, so you are sure that your employees will not leave and open and set up a new company in competition with you, or that the competitor comes in and takes your employees. So they could also be used as a complement, and therefore partially, let's say, cancel out the substitution effect. The two can be at play together, of course. So we provide some evidence by matching our data, so individual data on the incidence of non-compete clauses to the estimates of labor market concentration in Italy that Andrea and co-authors, and particularly Giulia Bovini and Federico Cingano for Italy, estimated in the case for Italy. We use the NUTS-free region level, which is, Andrea will tell you more about the details of their estimates, but it's one of the levels they use. It's a relatively detailed one. But on the other hand, we can only use one-digit occupation level. We only have one-digit occupations. We could not go that far in having all 3-4 digits as one should when working with labor market concentration. Therefore, that's why I say it's just a correlation, and we are using coarse measures of concentration, and then we estimate, let's say, the correlation between the two controlling for some worker and firms characteristics. And here are the results. So we find a negative correlation between labor market concentration and the probability of being bound by a non-compete clause. The correlation is not very strongly significant and is essentially driven by medium skilled workers. The magnitude of the correlation is not that small, because an increase in one standard deviation from the average, at least for the full sample, corresponds to a 14% increase in the probability of being bound, to a decrease in the probability of being bound by a non-compete clause. So the magnitude is not so small, the significance is not very strong. I honestly I'm not fully able to explain why this is driven by medium-skilled workers, except that maybe for high-skilled workers, non-compete clauses are used indeed to protect trade secrets and investment in trainings, irrespective of the state of labor market competition in the area, whereas for medium-skilled, they are more used to restrict mobility and wage bargaining, the bargaining power of the workers, and therefore is more tightly linked to local labor market concentration. As I said, this is just a first suggestive results, but of two streams of literature that so far I've not managed to connect, also because of that data issue, as I said. So labor market concentration uses very granular data. Non-compete clauses for the time being have been based on surveys, relatively of a limited number of observations, and so it's not easy to connect the two, but I think more can be done, and it's certainly interesting. And finally, quick reference to other tools that can be used in Italy to restrict the ability of workers to move to another company. The first is the notice period. Is in many countries, permanent workers who want to quit have to give a notice to the employer, and the notice can be of different duration, can be short or very long. So we collected the notice period in the survey, and we benchmarked to, in Italy this is regulated by collective agreements, so we had to benchmark it to what is foreseen in the collective agreements. And we see that overall there is no sign of misuse of notice periods. So the notice periods tend to be under the limits set by collective agreements, even though, of course, for us it's just maybe a lower bound. And we do find a negative correlation with non-compete clauses, but not with the duration of the notice itself. Something that was discussed in this year of the so-called Great Resignation and difficulty of finding workers was that anecdotically, trade unionists started saying that employers started to introduce in employment contracts a penalty for early quit of temporary workers. So in Italy, when a temporary contract cannot be ended by both parties. So if you are the employer and you terminate the temporary contract, you must pay the full salary. If you are a temporary worker, in theory, you cannot quit unless, of course, you come to an agreement, which happens, and we do see significant numbers of quits among temporary contracts as well. However, in some cases, the employer could go to court and say, I've been damaged, I want to be repaid for the damage of the early dismissal. I hire you for the summer season at the Grande Italia Hotel, now you leave me in the middle of July, how I'm gonna do? You have to pay for the damage you have given me. And in some cases, employers are trying to predetermine this damage in the employment contract, say if you leave before the official date of termination, you have to pay me X hundred euros or X thousand. This is a difficult, possibly not enforceable clause, because whereas indeed the employer has the right to be compensated for the damage, is almost impossible to establish the fairness of the damage ex ante. So if you leave and you still have to work for 6 months, is very different if you leave and you only had a few weeks or a few days. So it's not easy to predetermine it. Nevertheless, 12% of temporary workers appear to have such clause in their employment contract, and there is a positive correlation with the non-compete clause. So in this case, employer seems to use both tools to restrict the risk that these people leave to a competitor by restricting both simply the fact that they are terminating the employment and the risk that they go to a competitor. So again, suggestive evidence that clauses in employment contracts restricting mobility do matter. So in conclusion, you see that non-compete clauses are only lightly regulated by the law. and courts retain a significant margins to evaluate each case. So far, they were not considered as a phenomenon of great relevance in the Italian labor market. However, our survey suggests that it's not a marginal phenomenon. The average incidence is not very different from the one found by several surveys in the US and other European countries, and also the patterns are very similar. So the non-compete clauses are not confined to high-skilled high-paid jobs or to workers with access to trade secrets. Moreover, a large share, despite not having the variability in regulation like in the US, we do see that a large share of non-compete clauses appear unenforceable, or the workers at the very least are not aware. And this does not matter for perceived enforceability. So does this call for an intervention from a policy point of view? It's very early maybe to come to firm conclusions. It's the first evidence we are bringing to the table, and therefore we want more to open the debate rather than coming with firm prescriptions. But certainly it could be discussed, the idea of banning the use of non-compete agreements for certain categories of workers. For instance, low-wage workers, like in Austria or in some states in the US, or to selected sectors and occupations, or to workers with access to trade secrets. The last two options are less easy to implement. It's easy to bypass sectors and occupations, and in any case not easy to define ex ante which sectors should be covered and which not. And the access to trade secrets sometimes is a little bit in the eye of the beholder. It's not obvious to say yes you have, no you don't, given that it's a secret. The second would be to include non-compete agreements in the so-called comunicazione obbligatoria, to make it at least more salient to firms. Comunicazione obbligatoria are mandatory communication when the employer hires a worker or fires someone, or there is a change in the contract. So this would make it more salient to the company, any change at least after the beginning, and of course would also have a more complete statistical picture. The third would be to increase and improve the transparency and fairness of the non-compete agreements. For instance, like it is done in the consumer, so-called consumer code, reporting the article of civil code in employment contracts, so that when employees read it, they also read what should be included, and so it cannot be possible that they forget to add the compensation or a time limit. One could also think about increasing simply collective agreements, taking the initiative in increasing the information on non-compete clauses or the regulation itself. Non-compete agreements can take themselves initiatives to provide more criteria and more clarity. And of course maybe involve antitrust authority for the role, at the very minimum, the role of non-compete clauses for product market competition. And finally, easy to do, raising public awareness. This tool is not very known in the public debate. There is no official page on any official website, government website, on how non-compete clauses should work. They are, I found some in France and Belgium, for instance, and some information campaigns among workers' representative and support services like the patronati could help at least those people that go to see these people to be aware that among the many things that are in employment contract, this should also deserve a close look. And with this, I'm done. Thanks a lot.
So thank you very much. Very exhaustive presentation. And now I would kindly ask Professor Starr from the University of Maryland to come here for. If you want to stay, as you prefer, yeah, maybe there. So then we can move right away to the general discussion after this presentation.
Ready? Hi, everybody. It's so good to be here. Thank you to Tito and to Lorenzo and Andrea for writing this amazing paper, the first really detailed look of non-compete agreements in the Italian labor market and really all of Europe. And it's just a real honor to be here to discuss it. So they describe this as a panorama of non-competes in Italy, and it truly is. It is an in-depth study of where you find them, of the law, of how enforceable they are, about what workers believe. In my mind, it shows the first systematic evidence of their ubiquity in this European context. I think it begins to put forth some evidence that challenge the supposed benefits of non-compete agreements that I'll talk about recently, especially the use of them in low-wage labor markets. And in particular, there are concerns that unenforceable non-competes are both super common, and by their estimates, as much as 60-some% of workers are bound by unenforceable non-competes that might limit their mobility. Finally, I just want to highlight that these findings, they largely mirror what we've been finding in the U.S. context, and I think they really set the stage for future work in the U.S. and in Europe. So let me highlight what I want to do in this discussion. I want to bring us back a little bit to the historical context and discuss some of the recent evidence. I want to discuss some of the recent policy movements and talk about the future of this area of research. So it's not hard to see that non-compete agreements are really having a moment in terms of their history. And what I mean by that is if you just look at the recent history, in the US in 2008, Oregon was the first state to ban non-compete agreements for low-wage workers. 8 years later after that, the Obama-Biden White House held briefings on non-compete agreements. They came out with a report in the US Treasury, and in the same year in the White House that recommended policies for various states. Since then, non-compete agreements have been on the platform of every presidential candidate on the Democratic side in 2020. In 2022 alone, there were that should be 2021. 2022 is right now. Last year, there were 69 plus state policies alone to regulate non-compete agreements. There were 7 federal bills and potential FTC regulation. Between 2015 and 2022, we've seen 12 plus US states pass bans on non-compete agreements for at least some workers. Now, the reason I say non-competes are having a moment is because if you look back in the history of non-competes, the first non-compete case was in 1414. Non-competes arose in the Guild era in Europe, where master craftsmen used them to take apprentices whom they trained for several years, and then they didn't want those apprentices to compete with them in the product market. And so that's where they originated from. They've been around for over 600 years, and courts have been grappling with what to do with them ever since. The next big case comes in 1611. This is Mitchell v. Reynolds, as a classic case in which the courts for the first time recognized that maybe workers could benefit from non-compete agreements. Sure, they give up their post-employment mobility, but maybe they get something more valuable in return. And this sparked an era of kind of a case-by-case reasonableness criterion that courts use to determine the enforceability of non-competes. Now, if you fast forward a few hundred years in the US, there was a lot of action in the late 1800s. California banned non-compete agreements in 1872. So did North Dakota and Oklahoma, the 3 states in the US, which are not very similar to those who don't know the US. These are very different states, but they've all banned non-compete agreements. And between the late 1800s and the action I just showed is basically a whole lot of nothing. There are some small changes here or there, but no large-scale events. So what you can see is that we're really, in the US, reaching a climax of policy interest, antitrust interest, something that we haven't seen before in the 600-year debate over non-competes. Which raises this natural question. Why was there such a long delay here? What happened to cause all of this? So let me try to articulate about, I think, a few reasons why. I think the first is that non-compete agreements found a voice in the monopsony power literature. And so if you go back to the classic Burdett-Mortensen on-the-job search model, which Alan expounded upon so nicely in his book, the idea is that on-the-job search gives firms monopsony power. If workers were to get offers every second of every day, we would reach a perfectly competitive market. If workers never get another offer, we reach perfect monopsony, regardless of the number of firms that are out there. So if you think about features like non-competes, features that make it harder for a worker to find a job, high concentration, no poach agreements, all of these can exacerbate monopsony power. And I think if you look to the US context in particular, what was happening over the prior 40 years is we had persistent wage stagnation. Well, we did see real wage gains at the top, but for most workers in the US, real wage growth was practically nothing between roughly 1975 and 2015. At the same time period, we saw job-to-job transitions falling by about 50%, and the startup rate also declined about 50%. And so some folks began to think that maybe there are restrictions on worker mobility, on entrepreneurship, that might be causing this wage stagnation and the declines in job mobility. So ultimately, what I think is there is new evidence for this 600-year debate. And let me just summarize the debate for those of you who are not familiar. So there are two sides, of course, and let me just summarize the first argument in favor of non-competes. As Alan highlighted in his talk, there's this notion of freedom to contract, which is that when two parties agree to a contract, we generally presume that it's in their benefit. Whenever you write down a model in economics of contracting, there's a constraint in there that you typically assume that no one would ever agree to those terms unless they benefited from them. Now, of course, in the literature on non-competes, that's not always seen to be the case. Of course, workers can sign these contracts under duress. They can sign them on the first day of the job when they go to the HR department and they're handed a stack of papers, and they have no bargaining power. And so at that point, you might think that the non-compete is just kind of a chain around workers. Now, the real reason that non-competes are contentious is because non-compete agreements are one way that firms can protect trade secrets, like confidential information, like client lists, secret formulas, et cetera, et cetera. And so you might think that non-competes are necessary for firms to invest in the development of such information. And the logic is pretty straightforward. If I was going to give a worker some valuable information and they go walk across the street to start a competitor or take that information to a competitor, they can appropriate the value of that information without having to pay for it. And so without a non-compete agreement, the firm may not invest in that information, they may not share it with the worker. Of course, there's some countervailing evidence here too. One is that the rise of Silicon Valley, some people claim, had a lot to do with California's ban on non-competes, because in California, in the tech sector, you could start a new company, you can move across jobs, and you can share information as you're going. And so some would have you think that maybe Silicon Valley wouldn't have occurred were it not for California's ban on non-competes. The second is that non-compete agreements may be part of a prisoner's dilemma. If you think about every firm doesn't want to lose its privately held trade secrets, its confidential information. It doesn't want to lose its workers either, and it also doesn't want to pay them more. And so if every firm does this, if every firm operates in this way, then what kind of labor market do we have? What kind of product market do we have? And so if we have a very, very stagnant market where nobody can move, nobody can start a new company, then maybe the only way out of this situation, where we're actually worse off, is to institute something like a ban on non-competes, which is what California did. So these are the ideas of Ronald Gilson, who wrote an influential article making these points in 1999. Okay, so what is the new evidence then that's coming to this debate? So I think that if I was to summarize, over the last 600 years, you can see both sides of these arguments, I think, and the courts have just grappled with them, and there's been no evidence to push us on one side or the other. And so the new evidence that's come about, I think, is very similar to that was uncovered in this paper. So there's anecdotal and systematic evidence of non-compete ubiquity. There's evidence that non-competes give firms what I would call intertemporal monopsony power, which is that they can take power today and exploit it by getting someone to sign a non-compete today. They actually gives them power in the future, right? At some point in time when the worker eventually wants to leave. And then finally, there are concerns that unenforceable non-competes are both common and harmful. So let me just walk through some evidence on each of these pieces. And I want to have you guys read some of these contracts, because unless you've actually read the text, this whole conversation can feel a little bit esoteric. So here's some anecdotal evidence. This was a non-compete agreement that was revealed in 2015 for Amazon. It was agreed to by a temporarily employed packer who was hired for 3 months over the holiday period, who made $13 an hour. And it says that during employment and for 18 months after the separation date, the employee will not, and I'll just read the highlighted part, engage in or support the development, manufacture, marketing, or sale of any product or service that competes or is intended to compete with any product or service sold, offered, or otherwise provided by Amazon, which is just an incredibly broad restriction once you realize that Amazon produces almost everything and ships almost everywhere, okay? When it came out that this contract was being signed by even temporarily employed workers making $13 an hour, Amazon apparently stopped the practice. So just a little bit of publicity caused them to change their mind. Here's the non-compete that really blew the lid off of the U.S. The U.S. policy world. This is a non-compete signed by minimum wage sandwich makers at a company called Jimmy John's, which is just a fast food sandwich chain. And I'll just read parts of it here. It says that the employee covenants and agrees that during his or her employment with employer for a period of 2 years after the effective date of termination, for any reason, he or she will not have any direct interest in or perform services for any business which derives more than 10% of its revenue from selling submarine, hero-type, deli-style, pita, and or wrapped or rolled sandwiches, and which is located within 3 miles of either, and this is the particular place of employment, or, and this is the big part, any such other Jimmy John's sandwich shop operated by Jimmy John's, one of its authorized franchisees, and one of its affiliates. Now, if you've never been to the U.S., Jimmy John's is a widespread widespread company, and somebody came and made a map of Chicago, which is a pretty, there's a lot of Jimmy John's over there. So this is where you couldn't work if you were in Chicago as a minimum wage sandwich maker in the restaurant industry. But the systematic evidence, I think, is maybe the most important here, which substantiates these concerns. So as Andrea went through, we found in the U.S. that between 18 and 28% of the current workforce is bound by non-competes. Even more striking is some of these firm surveys, where Colvin and Shearholes, and I have some other firm survey work which bolsters this, but about 50% of firms in the U.S. say they use non-competes, and about 30% of them say they use them for all workers, indiscriminately. You join the company, no matter what you make, no matter how you work, if you're a volunteer, you still sign this non-compete agreement. They're rarely negotiated. Sometimes they're delayed. You don't see them until you start the job. There's some recent evidence. If you're interested in this, the U.S. government is now collecting data on non-compete agreements in a long-running survey called the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. They now have data on non-compete agreements, and they're going to soon add a question on non-disclosure agreements. And there you find similar estimates that the use of non-competes among workers in this data is about 18%. So what are the evidence challenging the supposed benefits from non-competes? So I want to start by looking at some natural experiments. So I mentioned that Oregon policy shock in 2008. This is the first low-wage non-compete ban. And so I wrote a paper about it with Mike Lipsitz. And so the results come out just very clearly from the time trends. So if you look at what happens to hourly workers in Oregon, who are the workers for whom non-competes were banned, and you just look at hourly wages in Oregon relative to other states, it jumps out at you that after the ban, we're in the Great Recession, so there's a little bit of a lag here, but the effects pick up, and we have an increase in wages of about 5% a few years after this ban kicks in, and then if you look at occupations where non-competes are used more commonly, the effects are even greater. When you look at job-to-job mobility changes, there's some noise in the pre-period, but you see a similar effect, which is that mobility begins to rise, and it's especially pronounced for within industry moves. Now, this is important because low-wage workers, we tend to think of having very fungible skills. They can move across industries. If you're flipping burgers, maybe you can do some other low-wage job. It's not a problem. And if that was your view of the labor market, then you would think that non-competes would have no effect on these workers, and yet this is what we see. Now, there's another natural experiment which is maybe even more powerful, which is that Hawaii banned non-compete agreements in 2015 for tech workers. And tech workers, you might think that's precisely where we should see the benefits of non-competes, because non-competes should be protecting trade secrets. Tech workers are sophisticated, they're savvy, they should be negotiating for compensating differentials when you agree to these things. And so when Hawaii banned non-competes in 2015, it's a nice natural experiment where you can study what happens to tech workers in Hawaii versus tech workers in other states, or tech workers in Hawaii versus non-tech workers in Hawaii. And so we do all those analyses, and the punchline's the same as the Oregon study, that it's not that tech workers are actually better off when you ban non-competes. It's not that tech workers were benefiting from non-competes. They benefited when they banned non-competes. Wages went up by about 4%. Job mobility rose by about 11%. Okay, and finally, these concerns that unenforceable non-competes are common and harmful. So I really appreciate the focus on unenforceable non-competes because it can be often overlooked when you have these 30,000-foot papers on state policies. Here's a quote from Harlan Blake in 1960, writing about the interim effect. And so this is not something that's new here. He says, for every covenant that finds its way to court, there are thousands which exercise an interim effect on employees who respect their contractual obligations and on competitors who fear legal complications if they employ a covenanter, or who are anxious to maintain gentlemanly relations with their competitors. Thus, the mobility of untold numbers of employees is restricted by the intimidation of restrictions whose severity no court would sanction. Okay, this comes back to the situation in it seems like Italy and in the US, because if you look at the use of non-competes in the US, this is the data from Colvin and Shearholz that Andrea was alluding to, where they surveyed employers. And if you look overall at their headline number, they find that 31.8% of employers use non-competes with all of their workers. That number is 28.6% for California-based employers, just a smidge lower. And if you need some evidence, this is my favorite non-compete. This is a non-compete for a volunteer job at a nonprofit in Silicon Valley in California, where as a volunteer coach, you agree not to start a similar company to help middle school girls go on runs to stay in shape. When you look at some of our survey evidence and you ask workers, was your non-compete a factor in your choice to turn down a job offer from a competitor? Overall, 41% of people said that it was, and you can see that number is not really different if you live in a state that doesn't enforce your contract versus a state that does. So I think in general, there's been, in the policy world, agreement now about the concerns of non-competes for low-wage workers, concerns about the transparency in contracting. Where there's been disagreement is high-skilled workers like CEOs and technology workers. So most people will think maybe a non-compete for an intern makes little sense. There are other tools firms can use. But what about an executive or a manager? It was, in the paper we just saw, 93% of managers said it was justified. Okay, so what do we do in that situation? So my view is that optimal policies trade off the benefits from private contracting and the social costs that non-competes can impose on workers and firms. And there are three areas here that I don't have much time to get into, so I'll just mention them briefly. One is that, as we were talking about earlier, non-compete agreements are signed by individual workers. But what happens in markets when there are so many of them, right? Do the effects of a market where 50% of the workers are bound by non-competes, how does that market look different than a market where 10% of them are bound? Okay, you might also ask the question, do firms actually value court enforceability of non-competes for high-wage workers? Firms are always going to tell you they want to enforce non-competes, but do they actually put their money where their mouth is? If I have a moment, I'll tell you about this recent study. And then finally, how to think about substitute restrictions. Right? As the prior paper showed, other restrictions do similar jobs without so bluntly restricting worker mobility. A non-compete is the most blunt. It says, you cannot take a job in this industry. And we're enforcing those agreements in order to protect confidential information when there's other ways to protect confidential information. There are trade secret laws, there's non-disclosure agreements, there's other types of agreements. So if I had more time, I would go through these, but I don't have that much time. So let me just highlight some takeaways. There's evidence that labor markets where non-compete agreements are used a lot are less dynamic overall. Workers have lower wages. The average worker is less mobile. This even includes workers who don't even have these agreements. It's a labor market-wide effect. There's some effect on prices that if your state begins to enforce non-compete agreements more vigorously, that firms consolidate and they raise prices. Here's the one paper that I want to talk about because I think it's brand new work, but it's also revealing. So this is a study looking at a recent policy in Washington, the state of Washington. And in 2020, Washington banned non-compete agreements for workers making $100,000 a year. And so if you were a worker in Washington in 2019 and you made $99,000 a year, there was some chance that your non-compete could be enforced, but in 2020, that chance is 0, okay? And so the idea of this paper is that if you have a threshold ban like this, that what those can reveal is whether firms value court enforceability, and you can observe that based on bunching. Because in this example, if a worker is making $99,000, all the firm has to do is give them a small raise of $1,000 to get them to the threshold, and then they can enforce the non-compete. And so if that's what's happening, then what we should see is firms giving workers raises to $100,000. You should see bunching at $100,000, and fewer workers making $99,000. So that's the test. It's very simple. And so all we do is we have data from Washington. And I don't have time to go into the full paper, but this is the distribution of wages in Washington. And we do a whole bunch of analyses, but there's basically no evidence of bunching. There's no discontinuity in the distribution. Okay, so our takeaway is that there's many reasons. We think it's probably because firms don't actually value the enforceability of non-competes, and we actually surveyed lawyers in Washington, and that's basically what they said. Okay, so let me turn to these other points here. One of my favorite graphs is this one, where non-competes are of course combined with other restrictions. So we talk about non-competes, but it's an empirical problem and a theoretical problem. How do you think about the effect of a non-compete when it's always bundled with other restrictions? And so there's some prior work of mine that shows that when workers do have all of these restrictions, that they're worse off relative to workers with only an NDA. Okay, I think I'm running low on time. So let me just say, these are related to the no-poach agreements that we've heard a lot about recently. But no-poach agreements are different from non-competes in a few ways. One, no-poach agreements are totally unobservable from the worker's perspective. They are a bilateral organization-level agreement. The worker has no idea. And they're also per se illegal. And in 2016, Kruger and Ashenfelter found that 60% of major franchises in the US had these. And a recent study by Kalachi and co-authors found that these no-poach agreements between franchises reduced posted wages by 3%. If you look at the Silicon Valley case that Alan referenced, a recent paper by Matt Gibson finds that a single no-poach agreement between those big tech companies reduced wages by 5%. Just one agreement between two strategically chosen companies not to compete reduced wages by 5%. I think that's a large effect. I think that goes a ways in helping us understand why monopsony is so important. Just one other employer choosing not to hire from you can reduce wages by 5%. Now, I just want to highlight this recent paper by Mike Lipsitz and Mark Tremblay, which bridges the non-compete, no-poach space. They ask, what's the difference between these two agreements? A no-poach is an agreement between two competitors in the market, but a non-compete agreement, that is an agreement between a firm and a potential competitor. And that's what raises antitrust concerns. Okay, so I was going to talk about non-disclosure agreements, but I think I'm out of time. So let me just say non-disclosure agreements can also be written incredibly broadly to conceal all sorts of information, and that firms are increasingly using these to protect their reputation and stifle negative information flows. Okay, so future directions of research. I think the results of this study suggest the issue of non-compete agreements is similar in scope in Italy as it is to the US, but what about the rest of Europe? If you surveyed firms, would you find much larger numbers like we found in the US, right? I think this is the beginning of, if the US is a leading indicator for what's going to happen in Europe, then maybe this is the beginning of the renaissance in Europe as well. We don't know a lot about the causal effects of non-competes themselves. We have these state policy shocks, which are nice, but there's been no study that says, here's where a firm has randomly used a non-compete here, but not there. And so this is a clear gap in the literature here. As I was talking about the other restrictions, there's a natural question, which is that, is it true that the other protection mechanisms that firms use, will those suffice in terms of spurring investment or protecting investments if we were to say ban non-compete agreements? How are firms going to substitute across these practices? Will they turn to no-poach agreements, right, which were illegal in the US? Will they just use their other restrictions even more? And then I think we need to collect some actual contracts. One of the reasons that we didn't know about non-competes is because we weren't asking workers. It didn't happen until I decided to survey workers in 2014 to figure out how common they were across the US. There were no existing estimates. And so we need to have some evidence on what's actually in those contracts that workers are agreeing to. Okay, you could analyze the language, you could see how contracts change in response to the law, you could see maybe there's other things workers are agreeing to that we have no idea about because we're not asking the right questions in surveys. Okay, and then finally I want to come back to this last point on a theoretical point, which Alan raised when he said, freedom to contract, we need to think about it again. What is wrong with our model of rational contracting that is so pervasive in economics? Do we need to embrace a more behavioral model? Is that true for all sorts of workers? Executives maybe have lawyers and maybe we're not so concerned about them. But what is the right model for contracting? I think we have lots of evidence that challenge the status quo. I don't think we have a lot of answers. Anyways, I'm a few minutes over, but thank you so much for listening, and thank you again for the fantastic paper.
Thank you very much. For the very deep discussion and for the comparison between the US and Italy. And this afternoon we're going to hear more about the rest of Europe. So now we have about half an hour for questions. So if you can stay here, and probably also Tito and Lorenzo, you want to join here to answer questions. We can add a couple of chairs. Okay, so we can pick questions from the public, and maybe Paula also you keep an eye on the chat, right? If people have. Okay, so let's pick like 3 questions, and then we, please.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. My name is Ana Sofia Rodriguez. I work at the Portuguese Competition Authority. I thought this was a very interesting panel. Non-competes are not in our remit, the remit of antitrust agencies, because they're not agreements between undertakings. But as Ivan was saying, that there are a lot of analogies or similar impacts that you can do with respect to no-poach agreements, which have, to some extent, the same effects. Now, when you're applying competition law, an area where litigation is strong, one of the issues that is put forward is precisely claims from businesses that they need these agreements, the no-poach agreements, like they claim for non-compete, in order to avoid, to protect intellectual property, in order to protect secrecy, and in order to be able to capture the rents of investment in human capital. Now, when one applies competition law, this can be called a claim of efficiency, and this can only be accepted within an agreement if the firm is able to demonstrate that the agreement is necessary to achieve that outcome, and there's no other less restrictive ways to achieve that outcome. Given the litigation nature of this, what I would ask is there any research that is being developed or that you could refer to that compares alternative ways to achieve these goals vis-a-vis non-compete or no-poach? And a note here to say that, and I think Evan has touched upon this, at the DOJ and the FTC, they took a joint position that they're treating no-poach as a per se restriction of competition, which means that they only need to prove that this agreement existed and not to prove its effects. At the Portuguese Competition Authority, we took the stance of saying that likely no-poach are unproportional ways to protect investment, because there's alternative ways to reach those outcomes that are less restrictive of competition. Are those well-founded positions, and what research can you refer us to? Thank you.
Okay, so another question here in the first row. Roberta? Here. And then we pick one from the chat, and then we give a first round of replies.
In fact, it's a question for both the presenter and for Ivan, because you touched the point in both presentations on the fact that banning may have a lot of negative effects, and in any case, enforceability is not a value for firms. So one of the key issues is that there should be the possibility of sanctioning, and that is not, as we see, may not be just an issue of antitrust. In Europe, in many countries, you cannot write in a labor contract, in principle, certain aspects of the labor contract, you cannot write something which is manifestly against the law, and so, no, that is not enforceable. So is there ways, and so this is more to the lawyer, which is in the panel, is there ways to enforce something, to empower the labor authority, empower labor inspectorates, because it can be, I mean, labor institutions, in the United States, you have similar institutions for that, because ideally, in the United States, typically in litigation, the maximum the worker can achieve is that the non-enforceable clause is not enforced, but there is no punishment for the employer. So there is no incentive for the employer not to use it. So any thoughts about that? Thank you.
Okay, so maybe we can wait for the questions from the chat, and instead Paolo Sestito had a question, and then we give a first round of replies.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is a very statistical question. The other one is a more theoretical one. And the second one actually is to both the authors and the discussant. The first statistical question is just whether you have any evidence that people who are on the net, who are on the web, that you reached through your survey, are, in a sense, people more likely looking for an alternative job. Because these are the people who are the ones with respect to whom the firm may be more interested in having a non-competing clause. Because, in a sense, the firm is trying to protect precisely vis-à-vis the potentially more mobile, choosier, and so on and so forth workers. This is a possible element to be considered, and because I still feel that your 16% for Italy is somehow an upper bound of the estimate. The more theoretical questions pertain to the value of unenforceable contracts for a firm. Actually, even showed us that the firm don't value the possibility of having with relatively low cost enforceable contracts, but still this prove that enforceability doesn't matter, but it says almost nothing about the value of non-enforceable clauses. What is, in a sense, the likely value of these clauses? Just a signal, a threat, but we know from theory, at least with rational agents, that the threat have to be credible in order to be useful, but maybe given that people are not fully rational, even non-credible threats may have some value, or it is just a signal. In a sense, a signal that you as a worker matter for me as a firm. Which of the two competing explanations of the value of non-enforceability do you believe is more relevant? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So already many deep questions for both the authors and the discussants. So who wants to start first?
Okay. Well, let me take a shot at answering some of these questions. We'll start with the antitrust issues. I understand where you're coming from. The U.S. faces some of the same questions about an individual non-compete. There's probably no market harm, but in the collective maybe there is some harm. But you don't adjudicate a case against the whole market. You adjudicate a case against a single worker. So my sense is your specific question was what research is there which would justify, I think in the case of no poach agreements, that they are not per se illegal. that there are less restrictive ways of protecting firm interests. That was the question, correct? So my answer is a no-poach agreement, which is a bilateral contract at the organization level, is a very weird way to protect your interests, precisely because you are going over the heads of the workers to try to restrict their mobility in the ultimate, in this line of thinking, in order to protect trade secrets. Well, why not just protect trade secrets by asking workers to sign non-compete agreements? Why not ask them to sign non-disclosure agreements? Those seem like the direct ways to protect those interests without resorting to going above the workers' heads to try to limit their mobility. And so I think that the answer to your question is that no-poach agreements, by and large, do not serve directly the purposes of protection. That argument, I think, is largely ad hoc. I'm not aware of, I mean, there's speculation about the links between non-competes and no-poach agreements. The no-poach agreements, of course, arose in California, where there were, where non-competes were not enforceable. But I haven't seen any real empirical work comparing the two. I think that's probably because it's hard to discover no-poach agreements until after they've existed. I have answers for all the others too, but I want to give you guys a chance to respond.
Well, no, first of all, let me thank Evan for the wonderful discussion and plenty of very interesting suggestions. And certainly this is just the beginning of a research agenda for us. And our task here was mainly to document the relevance of these clauses in the Italian case. You know, it's since we do find that this is relevant, I think we plan to do much more work and clearly also look at labor market effects of this type of restrictions. One possible way to interpret the negative correlation that we do find between concentration and non-competes is that in a way, in case where you do not have a strong concentration of employers, you need to resort to these schemes so there is some sort of substitutability between labor market concentration and non-competes. So in that terms, perhaps you know, the relationship that one can think of between you know, the question that was asked about no poaching and no competes is one where when you can achieve collusion, and that, you know, in a way is the same, is a way to achieve the type of situation that you would have in a case of a largely concentrated labor market. You don't need that much of the non-competes, but clearly this is something to be way more thoroughly investigated. The only thing I can say is that in the Italian case, we did also a survey of employers and of head of personnel, and we did ask also about no poaching, but this was a non-representative survey and was simply to get an idea. And it seems to be also that type of condition quite widespread. So I think that you know, that's a reason why perhaps, and we will talk about that perhaps in the roundtable this afternoon, antitrust authorities should really pay a lot of attention to even non-competes. One thing that I think is important, many people here have been stressing the fact that there is not full information and that there are many behavioral responses to non-competes, and you know, the enforceability is not so important. You know, there are deterrents that are there, even if in principle these clauses are illegal. Now, I think that in that respect, a concern that is not much in the literature, but I think should be raised, is on the role that non-competes play also on earning inequality, because the standard assumption is that since these clauses are mainly related to top managerial position and are there where they bite the most, in principle they should not have you know, adverse effect on earning inequality. If anything, they should in a way, affect wages of workers in the top of the wage distribution. If instead there is a problem of non-cognitive biases that is related to the presence of these clauses, then a whole set of other implications opens up, and often there is evidence, for instance, that in the job search behavior, people with low skills seem to have a stronger pessimistic bias than people with high skill and relatively high wages. So if that also applies to the presence of non-competes, then we may have that these non-competes actually increase inequalities, and that's something that I think should be clearly under thorough investigation. I think that Giovanni may have something to say instead about the legal issues.
Yeah, I mean, about the issue of the enforceability of this non-compete agreement, we may see that, I'm going to start from the US. In the US, it's quite hard for workers to bring the case before the court because of the litigation costs, because of arbitration clauses. And then what we are seeing right now, as Evan said, is a potential intervention of the FTC. The FTC has to provide that rulemaking activities, so to perform a rulemaking activities, and then we can see perhaps adjudication, and I think there is a legal basis for rulemaking activities in this field. If we talk about Italy, we saw that case law is quite not that easy to understand, to assess, even after a quite deep investigation. And so we can think about, can we have other enforcers? So we have the Ispettorato del Lavoro, the Ministero. We can see, I would say, in a lot of cases, the Vigilante, so the Ispettorato del Lavoro, they go to the company and they actually take a deep look at contracts, at practices, employment conditions. And so if they see a contract and they find out that there is a provision, a clause that limit post-employment opportunities and there is no compensation, this is actually null, but it's null in the court. So it's a long process to go to the court, and therefore the Ispettorato, what they can do right now, basically nothing. They can say, okay, it's null, but then if you go to court, you are the worker, you need to defend yourself, to hire a lawyer, to wait a lot of years, because we know that in Italy the duration of trials are quite long, and therefore we may think about suggesting as a policy indication the putting effort of sanctions, because we have a lot of these sanctions for short-term employment contracts and a lot of these things. So we may say, if I access to your company and I take a look at your contracts and I see that in a lot of cases there are non-compete agreements that are not enforceable, you may need to pay fines, and that will also help to intervene at an early period, not waiting for the case law.
An answer to Paolo on the statistical question. Let's say I don't know. We don't know whether respondents and people online are looking more to quit than others. Let's say we have a question on that. I'm not aware of a similar question in more standard surveys that we could benchmark and see whether the willingness indeed change. However, let's say in our defense, I think the work of Evan in the US, which is not Italy, but let's say is what I can refer to, has shown that the results using a similar survey, the one in 2014, to more established survey, the NLSY, which is a super well known and established survey, as they gave the same percentage. So at least for the United States, we can conclude that the online survey, despite all the limitations and homemade dimension of the survey itself, delivered reliable results. So I don't know if this is the case in Italy too, but to be seen. Of course, one idea would be to introduce a question on the use and the presence of non-compete clause in established survey like the LFS, or in an ad hoc module of the LFS. One could think of having a set of questions on similar items, on non-compete, NDAs, and so on and so forth. So this could also allow to cover the entire European Union. On the signal versus threat, I don't have an answer there, but certainly it seems a little bit more than a signal. So we also looked at the incidence of unenforceable clauses by workers' characteristics, and not surprisingly, we find a higher incidence of unenforceable clauses among low-skilled, low-paid. So it seems that firms are less careful about what they draft when they know that this person is likely not going to court. They appear to be a bit more careful when they know that the person may know, A, what is the law, and B, has the power or the resources and time to go to court, which is a super time-consuming and money-consuming process. It's not something that can be easily done.
Let me just say one thing on the unenforceability of these contracts to the two questions. One of the things that happened in Washington after they banned non-compete agreements for workers making under $100,000 is they established this bright line of $100,000, and they simultaneously established a penalty, which is that if a firm was caught using non-compete agreements for workers making under $100,000, then they had to pay, I think it was $5,000 per non-compete agreement. And the damages, that money would go to the workers. And so one of the things that's happened in the state of Washington, if you look at the filings most recently, you'll find that there are several class action lawsuits being brought by lawyers who know that these firms are using unenforceable non-competes to collect on those damages. And so I think that, at least in Washington, these penalties are likely going to have the effect of reducing the use of non-compete agreements, whereas it's not quite the same in California. There's no precise penalty like there is in Washington. So many state laws are beginning to adopt these sorts of penalties. And I also want to say one other thing. The consternation about online surveys is well warranted. In the U.S., as Andrea said, we added these questions to the NLSY. I also want to say that we also partnered with Cornell, and we did some random digit dial surveys to ask about these restrictions and others, and the numbers were almost identical on these random digit dial surveys. In fact, my sentiment is the exact opposite of yours. My guess is 16% is probably a lower bound, and that's because when you ask firms, the firms tend to know. And all of the estimates in the U.S. when you ask firms are much higher. And so I would expect that if you did a firm survey in Italy, you'd come up with much, much larger numbers than from the individual survey. That is my guess.
Okay, thanks a lot. So we are almost over time, but since there were some people who wanted to ask questions, yeah, maybe time for another couple of questions. So Franco?
Well, I thought it was the last one before lunch. And just a quotation from a couple of centuries ago, from Don Giovanni by Mozart. The commendatore has accepted the invitation. Don Giovanni has gone to hell, and his servant Leporello says, "E io vado all'osteria a cercar padron migliore." I just wonder whether sending the entrepreneur to hell is one of the solutions that you have found for monopsony.
Thank you, Franco. And then another. So one here, Roberta, here on the. If you can all keep questions a bit short, so we give space to more people. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel almost ashamed of asking a question after such a distinguished question just now, but very, very briefly. So the first one on the causal side, or the potential causal interpretation of some of these estimates. So are these clauses a driver or a manifestation of employer power? And I'm wondering specifically about the difference between enforcement and enforceability of these clauses. I wonder if there are statistics or if there is some interest in collecting statistics about the number of filings and trials around the enforcement of these clauses across countries. I think it would be really nice to see the sort of the magnitude on the legal side in terms of the number of cases that are brought before employment tribunals, and also the decisions by these tribunals regarding these cases. And then on the policy side, so I'm wondering about the scope of information interventions to address some of these problems. And specifically, I'm thinking about the potential role of representatives of workers, trade unions, firm-level councils, perhaps public employment services in providing more information to workers so that they regard these clauses in an appropriate way, knowing that they, in many cases, perhaps are not enforceable at all. I found really interesting the remark by Andrea earlier on that most of the most important collective agreements in Italy do not appear to have clauses about this. So this makes me think that either there is a manifestation of employer power that trade unions don't seem to want to address, or maybe they think that this does not matter that much. So it may also have relevant implications in terms of policy.
I have a question from an online participant, so I'm gonna read it for him. Is a question by Giacomo Edoardo Di Marco. He says, under Italian law, if a non-compete agreement is declared void, the employee must give back the sum received as compensation. Although there is some debate as whether this is lawful, these sums are paid over the course of the entire employment relationship and may become quite large. Do you think making these sums non-recoverable would dissuade employers from making non-compete agreements or make employees more likely to challenge these non-compete agreements? Thank you.
Okay, then there were two guys there that had been waiting for quite a long time, so.
Thank you. Do you think that there is a link between the incidence of non-compete clauses and the competition in the product market? Because maybe like in the Italian case, many small and medium firms may resort to monopsony power to increase their profitability as their only chance. And so maybe could it be like a backfire of the increased competition in the product market?
Maybe there was another one there? Okay. Okay, thanks a lot. So I think there are no more questions. Okay, Francesco.
A super quick question for the report and for the Italian report. Have you asked the respondents about like whether the clause is in written form or not? Maybe I didn't get it. You Andrea talked about this, but maybe I didn't get it because like I think that would also matter for the enforceability and for like the perception of the worker. And also, have you surveyed the respondents on actual damages they got through because of clauses? Like, for example, they terminated the contract in the previous period of their life, and they couldn't accept another job even if they got an offer because of like a realization of that clause being in their previous contract agreement.
Okay, thank you. Then I leave the floor as usual to.
Yes. No, I don't think that sending the employer to hell is the end goal, but yes, ideally, indeed, finding the right regulation, which is the right balance, which is the big challenge, as I think all lectures since the one by Alan Manning before said, and indeed is not straightforward, but I think a discussion is warranted, especially exactly on the use of clauses that are pretty poorly known and poorly discussed, certainly in the Italian debate. And indeed, I don't know, in the afternoon we should have a representative of the trade union, so we could ask her why they don't discuss and negotiate this, whether because they didn't think about that, or let's say it's certainly true as an outsider that the employment contract is already fairly complicated, collective agreements are already fairly complicated, there are tons of other issues, maybe more prominent issues from wages to other issues, and maybe this never came really on the radar. Also possibly because people thought that simply it is used just for the high-skilled people and not really an issue, but we should ask them. On enforcement and enforceability, it's an excellent question indeed. The issue is that, Lorenzo, correct me if I'm wrong, but let's say I'm not aware of cross-country data, but even in Italy, we don't have a complete picture. We don't have a database with all cases that we can search. The existing database are partial, and they collect what they found. Let's say certainly the highest court is all cases from the highest court are included, but not all. So we don't have a complete picture. Also, what we did was based on, let's say, a partial one, but it's not a statistically representative analysis of the case law. On the clause to give back money, maybe I refer to Lorenzo, but certainly you can see that it can be challenging and unclear what the result of challenging a non-compete clause what could be the result at the end of the day. Finally, to Francesco, we asked whether the clause is in the employment contract, so it's written in the employment contract. We also ask about behavioral consequences, let's say, of the clauses, but this is part of the work that we still have to do. So there's, let's say, at the very minimum, a second report, but also, to be honest, a more challenging one, where we should look at the impact of having a clause and maybe different types of clause on job search, on past behaviors or present one, and on wages, on training. We do have that information, but we haven't exploited yet. Let's say it's on the agenda, and yeah, but certainly a bit more challenging because there you immediately enter into significant endogeneity issues, and so you should be a bit smart, as Evan has been in the US, to try to at least find some signs, maybe not strong causality, but some elements, given that we have no discontinuity, no policy change for the time being.
Let me just say, on the someone asked about product markets. I didn't have time to get into it, but there is a wide body of evidence documenting that at least the enforceability of non-compete agreements tends to deter new firm entry, in particular within industry spin-outs. And so I think there are certainly concerns about product markets as well. I think it's largely underexploited. I think it was Tito said in the beginning, the connection between labor and product markets. This is a space where they're intimately connected because the restriction applies to both of them. And I don't think we have a good understanding of the downstream outcomes for consumers at this point.
Yeah, just to add a couple of things to what Andrea said. About the case law, we have access to most of the decision of the Court of Cassation, which is the higher court in Italy, but we do not have access to the lower courts, which are probably the most interesting because it may take like 10 years to go before the Supreme Court, so you may decide to go to the first court, to the tribunal, and then perhaps you go also to the House of Appeals, but then perhaps if there is the same decision, then you do not have that procedural strong incentive to go further. So it's really quite uneasy to have a broader picture. And there are some work right now, thanks to the European Fund, they are trying to collect all these cases, but it may take a lot of time. So just to come back also to the issue of repayments, if the clause is null, it's a big issue. Of course, it's like in the cases when a bogus employee go to the court to to obtain the right classification as an employee. And in a lot of cases we have seen in Italy, they need to give back money to the employer because before they were taxed in another way. And so this is of course a big issue that can be addressed like with measures that are like sort of sanctions. So providing a guarantee that you are not, if the clause is null, you are not going to be required to give back the money or things like this. But this comes back also to the issue of enforcement and sanctions. So, yeah.
In the interest of time, just a simple consideration. Clearly, a rationale for putting some restriction on the mobility of workers for medium and small size firms may be to preserve specific human capital of a firm. But there are certainly better tools to deal with in cases of temporary shocks hitting firms. And this is something that we have been investigating quite thoroughly also during the pandemic. And these are short-time work schemes and other things that keep workers attached to the firm and preserve the human capital of these firms. These clearly are things that work for temporary shocks, not for permanent ones as those that were faced by Leporello. So I think this would not be applied. So I think time is over for...
Yeah, so thank you everybody for attending. Thanks to the authors of the report, to the discussant. And next there is the lunch, which is going to be served at the Hotel Grande Italia. Right, Robbie? Hotel Grande Italia. Okay.
400 meters from here.
Yeah, 400 meters from
left
here.
Left and then left again.
Left again. Okay, thank you. Thank you.